Hello, good morning, everybody. We are in session 74, teaching basic skills to complex skill sets. And I have a few announcements to make before I introduce Amaris. I'm Dean DeSalvo. I'm facilitating and introducing Amaris here. Just a couple quick notes. The exhibit hall is open today until noon. Please join us for the keynote speaker at 4:30 in the President's Hall at the end of all the sessions today. And in order to get continuing education credits, you must complete the hand-in verification form at the registration desk prior to departing and the last day of attendance. And this is where all the codes go that you jot down at the end of the day. You can access the PowerPoint and handouts for the session via conference website or the wpsu app. And we're asking that upon the completion of each presentation that you give us feedback, please. It's very helpful and helps us make improvements to the presentations via the wpsu app as well. And finally, there's a children's play. The theme is Update Earth, and that is today, room 108 at 3 o'clock p.m. So to introduce Amaris, well, I'm a parent of a child with autism, and I met Amaris last October, and she was a superstar in my mind because I saw her on video, and I'm like, who's this unapproachable person? I'll never get to meet her. And I see her on these videos, and so professional. And we went to a boot camp, and within 3 hours, it changed our life. We actually got to talk to her. We packed up our stuff. We moved. We did whatever we had to do to be with her. So she's so giving, so loving, so careful about how she presents the material, but also she does it with a heart, and it's beyond the academic that sometimes we see, and it bridges that gap that we all really need to understand that these are really people that we're working with and that we're helping. And the help that she gives is beyond just the masses that we see, you see her on these videos, but it's more also about the individual, and she recognizes that too. So, you know, from my personal heart, she's one of the kindest people I've ever met, and she's made such a change in my life, and Ava's life, and my wife's life. So we're just so happy to have her, and I just need to let her talk now. So thank you very much. Amaris DePuglio.
Just have to stop making me cry during introductions. Thank you, Dean. That was probably the most beautiful introduction I've ever had in my entire life. And you know, I with pride say that is the reason I'm here, because I do care about children, and I care about the staff that work so hard with children and who go through so much. I've met so many teachers that are on the verge of resignation, and it's simply not because they don't care, but simply because they're tired of not knowing what to do and not having much success, or parents who are desperate. And this topic today is probably one of my favorite topics to present, because one of the things that I feel people struggle the most with is, what do I teach? When do I teach it? And every single one of us who cares about these children or the individuals we work with, we care so much that we're in such a rush and so eager to have them make progress. And with that motivation to have them make progress, what often happens is we move too quickly forward. And that's not always the best decision, because moving too quick too soon before you have the necessary component skills often results in then having all these weak repertoires that don't really result in getting strong skills that are going to lead to better acquisition in the future, better generalized responding, and better generativity. So that's what our session is all about today, is the sequencing. How do we sequence skills? And what I'm going to do during this presentation is start from the most basic skill set and go to complex. I'm not covering, of course, all the complex skills. There's simply not enough time. That is impossible. But at least covering from your very early learner, basically those students who come in with no skills or very, very little skills, to our sort of intermediate learners on their way to advanced that are already starting to learn some skill sets that sort of lead into conversation. So that's where I'll end the skill sequence. So the question is the following. How do we get to these places? I just recently had these two experiences with my daughter and wanted to share them with you because for those of you who are out there who have, whether it's children or students, who haven't gotten to a place who you feel, well, I need to teach them to talk in phrases. Why are they still talking in single words? Why are they not? Why is what they're saying so unnatural? There's so much effort we make, and so I wanted to show this at the start to let you know that doing it in the proper way is what gets us there. So I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about these. So recently, I have this iPad that's actually a work iPad. I have a personal one too. For some reason, my work iPad seems to be a lot more valuable to my daughter, and she likes to steal it a lot and use it, and it's like her most valuable reinforcer. So she was using it, and I needed it at the moment. So I say, Sarah, where's the iPad? And she says, she replies, and it was the iPad, not yours. She replies, just like this. I'm not sure. I think it's in the basement. And for most people, this would not be reason to start bawling, but I did. I could not believe that she could say such a phrase with such prosody that sounded so natural. And I said, when did she learn this? When did she learn to say, I'm not sure? I think it's in the basement. Similarly, I know Mike at this very moment is talking about advanced man training, but we didn't even get to the point where we had to directly program for how to get these more complex mans. What we did was teach really, really strong skills, get the skill to be fluent, get it to be generalized, and what wound up happening is that then you get these kind of results. So last year we had gone to Myrtle Beach, and while we were there, she had seen this raft, she fell in love with it, and so of course we went to a store to find it, and we blew the raft up for her, and she used it every day. She brought it back home, and it turns out that the beginning of this summer, she popped the raft by accident, right? Thank you so much, Laura. So we got to Myrtle Beach this time without the cool raft, and you know, this is part of the whole party at Myrtle Beach, and we went there again just a couple weeks ago. And when we got there, we all start walking down to the beach. We get there, and we're taking all our paraphernalia out, you know, the whole sand toys, everything. And she looks down and she says, there's no raft. Mommy, let's go buy a big raft. We'll blow it up and take it to the beach so I can ride the waves. And again, just completely flabbergasted, because this is not something you see often unless the individuals we work with already have this kind of complex conversational language. But when we work with the students that come in with simple language, it's not every day that you see this happen. And how did we get there? Well, we got there through careful sequencing from the start. And so just to inform you, that first point that I'm going to start talking about, that's the point where my daughter was when we started working with her. So I think it's important for you to keep that in mind as I go through this presentation. So one of the things that happens is we're provided with really good teaching procedures, teaching protocols that explicitly tell us how to teach. The problem is that doesn't necessarily, no matter how hard we teach, no matter how often we teach, it doesn't necessarily result in the outcomes that we're looking for, having those generalized repertoires, meaning repertoires where we teach just a set of things, of exemplars, but now the individual is able to respond to novel exemplars of whatever you're teaching, whether it's the name of an item, to say what somebody's doing, anything that you teach, that now if you give the same type of direction for a different, so if I taught this water bottle, now I show a water bottle that even looks very different, and they can still tact or name that water bottle, right? That's not very often that we see that kind of result with many of the students. That's one of the problems. They're not generalizing the skills. And then the other one that we don't see very often is generativity. What do I mean by generativity? Meaning new responses that were never taught or emitted before. So now with the component skills that you have, with the baseline skills that you have, you're able to come up with new responses that you've never done before. And those are your two goals when you're teaching. Teach for generalization and generativity and for the big picture. So what happens is when we're not systematically teaching all of the different functions of language, the mans, the tacs, the echoics, the interverbals, and teaching them under the right sources of control, so we're not teaching rote responses, teaching when the student has the component skills ready, then we generally don't get to this end goal of getting generalization and generativity. So one of the individuals who has taught me most about this issue is actually presenting at this very moment, which is Dave Palmer. And one of the things he always says is, you know, complex behavior, most of the behaviors we actually engage in on a day-to-day basis, they're not behaviors that have been directly shaped or reinforced. So we talk about, and I know some of you have heard this probably throughout the conference, that concept of reinforcement. That reinforcement follows behavior. It's something that follows behavior, and therefore that behavior is more likely to occur in the future under similar circumstances. And when we're teaching those first skill sets, we use direct reinforcement for the skills that we're teaching, because then it'll be likely that they'll engage in those skills in the future and that we can establish those skills, right? However, us as adults, and even most typical developing children by the age of 3, most of the things they do have not been directly taught. They are instead a recombination of already things that you know, things that you already know, that now you can recombine in all different ways to engage in novel responses, right? So Palmer calls these the building blocks of complex behavior. He also names them atomic repertoires, right? These are like our atoms that then we can put together and recombine in all different ways to make different molecules. So in the same way, we can recombine all these behaviors to make all different new behaviors under conditions that have some similarity, or that, of course, would in fact control those type of responses. So we're going to start by doing a little exercise together, and I do want everybody to respond. For those of you watching via webcast, you don't necessarily have to respond because I can't see you, but if you want to, you're welcome to participate. So I want you to read this, and I want you to actually respond to this as you see it here. Beautiful. Have you ever in your lives been told, after I clap, put your right hand over your left eye and wave after I snap my fingers? Has anyone ever given you that direction? I would venture to say no. However, every single person here was able to do that. How and why? Well, it's because of those component skills, the atomic repertoires. Because what you do have is the concept of put. You know what that concept means. You know the concept of left. You have the concept of hand. You have the concept of right. You have the concept of eye. You have the concept of clapping, and you get the idea, right? Now the next one, I'm going to guess that this won't be a problem either, right? Because you have these repertoires and you can already do this. So I want you to do this next one and read it silently again. Mapo, sombrilla, licuadora. Anybody? So I'm wondering what the problem here is that you can't follow this direction. I'm assuming I don't have any Spanish-speaking people in the audience either, because if I did, then you would know that what I was saying was to put your pinky, your left pinky, behind your left ear. When I say what belongs in the kitchen, which was the blender, that was licuadora. But see, you don't have those atomic repertoires, so you can't do that. And then I said, then stand up when I put my hands in the air. However, you would not be able to follow that direction because you don't have those atomic repertoires. So these are the kinds of things that sometimes we don't even think about when we're presenting skill sets to students. I could teach you all to do that in 2 seconds, errorlessly. I could say, licuadora, and I could do this. and you model it because you have imitation skills. And now I say again, licuadora, and you do it again. I could teach it errorlessly. But how does that help in relation to, in the future, you being able to respond to the word licuadora when you don't have the concept of what licuadora is, right? That wouldn't help. So we often wind up teaching in that manner, where we teach students errorlessly by using prompt procedures. We teach the response, but we don't teach the response under the right sources of control, and we don't teach those component skills strong enough that then in the future they can use them for novel things. So that's what we're getting at. So what are the common issues that we see? Failure to respond in novel ways, failure to respond with novel exemplars or in novel places to novel people at a novel time. I could give, the list can go on. Or responding to very limited cues in their environment, meaning that it's only under very structured or specified conditions, constricted conditions, that they're able to respond. So oftentimes we see students who are superstars when you're teaching at the table. They respond fluently. Now you just happen to be walking down even to the cafeteria, there's something in the hallway, you ask them what it is, they've responded to that 50,000 times when you were doing intensive teaching, but they don't tell you. Or the principal comes in to visit the classroom and happens to squat down and say, hey buddy, what's your name? And you taught them that 1,000,000 times. And they were able to do it 1,000,000 times, but now they don't respond to the principal, it's a new person. So that's not the stimulus I respond to. So this is the reason why we have to understand these issues so that we can address them early on, so we have results like the ones you saw on that first slide, right? So what are the ways to assess this issue? Well, first of all, programming systematically, making sure that when we program, from the start, we understand that we're teaching those atomic repertoires, that we're teaching those component skills that later on are going to build to more complex skills. If you're not focused on establishing the component skills, that's one of the reasons you wind up moving too fast if you don't have an understanding of when do I know I've established this component repertoire? When do I know I'm ready to move on now to something else, right? So remember that teaching basics is not going to suffice, right? Then there's a necessary step to teach complex skills. One of the things that happens is that when you teach the basics very, very strong, some of the complex skills we wind up getting for free, and I'll talk about those when we move on. We get them as generative responses because of the strong component skills we taught initially. So the other thing that's necessary is making sure that what we're teaching, it's not based on, this is where we start in my classroom. This is where I think I should start. No, it should always be based on students' assessment, baseline data. We know where they are. We know how strong those skills are. We know how fluent they are, and that's what determines what we move on to next. Saying something like, well, the student already has this many tags, so I think we can move on to this, does not suffice to make a determination on whether you can move on or not. So we're going to go over criteria for making those decisions on moving on to another program. So those are the kinds of guidelines that you want to look at when you're programming. Some of the critical atomic repertoires that we establish are the following. Imitation, doing what somebody else does. I mean, especially at a conference like this, half of our survival is just following the other people. Because we're so confused and lost and this is so huge, right? So how much of what we learned in life is simply a result of being able to imitate what somebody else does? It's one of the most critical learning skills, and yet it's not once or twice that I'm confronted with the phrase by teachers or by a parent, I don't understand the point of wasting time teaching my 13-year-old how to tap a block. Why is that important? Well, you see, 3-year-olds can actually imitate pretty much almost everything they see, but this child can't. And imitation is one of the ways that we learn. So if you teach good imitation, now you don't have to spend your entire life teaching every single response that you would learn through an imitative prompt. Because if you can teach it to a level where it becomes generalized fluent, where it becomes independent, spontaneous behavior, now they can learn novel things just like typical developing children do without us having to do intensive teaching for the rest of our lives. That's why it's critical. So why are we wasting time tapping a block with a 13-year-old? They don't even play with blocks anymore. Well, because that 13-year-old can't imitate anything, and tapping a block is a lot easier than taking a screw off a bolt. That's why. And because it's important to sequence from easy to hard, and we have to start somewhere. If we make it hard, now it takes us 3 months to acquire a skill if we're lucky, and we've wasted instructional time of teaching a repertoire. So for those of you who have that question, and I said 13 as a random number, it could be 12, 13, 17, it doesn't matter what the age is. The point being, you always start at baseline and you sequence from easy to hard, both for programs as well as for the targets you select to teach. The sister of that, echoic, saying what other people say. We know that some students don't have vocal behavior, or they have very, very poor vocal behavior, understood, and not all of them are going to be able to develop a fluent echoic repertoire. But if they do have vocal behavior, we should be focusing on it. If they don't, there should still be a focus on somehow shaping vocal behavior in some way to the extent possible. Because even if the student uses an alternative response form, such as sign, they're going to be better understood if they have some vocal approximation along with the sign than if they don't have it at all. Which is why we say anytime you're using sign, you want to make sure you're always also modeling the response of the vocal response form, because you never know when that's going to get correlated enough that now the movements get paired with that vocalization. And that's why oftentimes you see on so many even of the videos we use that students who are signers then are emitting vocalizations, and oftentimes even without being able to predict that early on, students actually become vocal. In terms of that echoic also, not forgetting that echoics do not stop. One mistake people make is, I don't have to teach echoics, he can already say any word. Well, echoic is not only about articulation skills. I'll give you an example. You'll see later on when we're going through protocols, how some protocols require longer responses. And if you have a student that if when you tell them, say, the girl is standing between the cat and the chair, they say cat chair, then you have a problem in getting the more complex skills to occur, because if you can't echo more words or more morphemes, then you're going to have a problem even if you can repeat any word anybody says. How do you ever acquire novel things because you hear them when you can't do that? So again, even in that manner, don't throw it out just because they can repeat words. Can they say 2 words in sequence? Can they say 3? Can they say 4? Can they say 4 that are trisyllabic words? Because a word that has 3 syllables and there's 4 of them is harder to say than 6 that are monosyllabic, that only have 1 syllable, because there's more morphemes in it, right? There's more sounds, so you get the idea. So that's another critical thing. Tax, in very simple terms, saying the name of things, but it goes beyond saying the name of things, and we'll go through several of those tact protocols. Textual behavior, being able to read words, but not forgetting that I could have you out loud venture to try to decode that Spanish text. And I can guarantee that many of you would probably be able to decode and read them, even if your pronunciation wasn't perfect. But that doesn't help you, does it, when you don't know the meaning of those words? So if anybody has the question, because we're not going to get to reading, what's the problem with starting to teach sight words? Even if they can't tact any items, that's the problem. Because what's the point of reading the ball rolled under the bed if I don't know what a ball is, I don't know what under is, I don't know what a bed is? That's why it's no point. So we first establish the component skills. Textual behavior is a critical behavior. Think of how many things throughout this conference you've responded to and have guided your behavior and you interacting in this conference by textual, by reading the schedule, reading the signs on the doors, reading where things are located, right? You've survived plenty through that textual behavior. But that textual behavior is not one of the very first atomic repertoires you teach, because textual behavior, in the absence of the concept that it represents, is meaningless, okay? And then the other one here is transcriptive behavior, so being able to copy a text or taking dictation, right? Writing text when somebody says something. These are just some, it doesn't mean they're all, but just some of those critical repertoires. So reminder, this is my biggest pet peeve. What you need to always focus on is, I'm not just teaching a response here. which is what generally we do. And then we all think, well, we're making progress here. Look, they're acquiring skills. They're acquiring targets. But if you're focused on teaching the response and not focused from the start on planning to teach those in a way that's going to lead to concept formation, to actually generalize those responses even to exemplars you've never taught, and that repertoire can then be used in more complex skills, then we're probably not going to be as effective. Yes, you get some progress. Yes, you get an outcome where that individual is probably likely going to be better than they were before, right? However, it doesn't mean that it's going to lead to a level of skill sets that now is going to allow to actually learning themselves without having to be directly taught or engage in novel responses, right? So, here are some considerations for teaching to build that complexity. And I know I've started mentioning this. So, teaching the concept. Those of you who were at the math session heard a little bit about this already. But what is a concept and what's the difference of a concept? Here's the difference between teaching a concept, and I'll explain this talking about the tact. So for those of you who are here, I know the session is tagged as intermediate, but I also know and respect that some people want this information and may not be intermediate but beginners, so we're going to do this for the sake of those people. So a tact would be a verbal behavior we engage in where the antecedent to that behavior is sensory stimulus, something we see, feel, hear, smell, or taste, right? That then we can say something about, whether it's the name of the item, it could be a property of the item or event, it could be a quality of it, it could be a relational position of one thing to another, but what governs, what controls the response is the sensory stimulus. So right now, while I was not looking, I could tell the door open. Why? I heard the click of the push bar. That is a tact, so I could say door opened, but the reason I said door opened is not because I saw it, but because I heard the sound. That's still a tact. Had I seen it just as well, that would be a tact because either I saw it or I heard it. Now, if I would say door open because somebody else said door open, that's no longer a tact, that's an echoic, okay? So the tact is controlled by actually the sensory stimulus. I could say, this feels a little bit rough because it has a tablecloth on it. It's not smooth. How do I tact rough? Because I felt it, right? I can feel it. How do I say the remote is beside the computer, the remote is between the podium and my laptop? Well, because I can see it, etc., 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 okay? So, here's the difference between teaching. Here's what we often do. One thing most of you have learned is, well, I have to teach more than one picture when I teach a tact of an item. So what teachers do is they'll write a goal, because they tend to see this on the VB map that says, there's an assessment piece on the VB map that says, can tact at least 3 exemplars for at least 50 items. The reason that's there is not to suggest that that's the repertoire you would teach. It's meant there as an assessment tool to tease out whether the student can generalize. And as a matter of fact, the recommendation we give is, if you taught that student 3 different pictures of 50 items or more in your classroom, when you assess that piece, you want to assess different exemplars of those pictures, not the one you taught. Take another student's pictures that they don't have and see if they can respond, because that's what tells you whether they have the skill to generalize or not. Because if you taught them to respond to those 3, they're going to get it correct, and now it appears like they don't have issues with generalization, right? So, what is that assessment there for? To teach you how to teach concepts, so you know to program for it if it doesn't occur. What is a concept? It's an extended tact. What is an extended tact? You're able to extend to provide a response to now a novel exemplar that's never been taught. So I can extend that response from the one that was taught to something that's not taught, because it has, of course, similar properties to the stimuli that I learned with, right? It would be another way to say generalization. That's just a way to call it generalization. But what does generalization mean? Well, it means that you have the concept. And having the concept mean you can apply that response, that behavior, to now novel situations and novel exemplars. How do we teach that? Well, by teaching multiple exemplars. How many exemplars? I don't know. It can mean There are students that you teach one exemplar and they generalize to all the novel ones. There's students who need 3, there's students who need 4, there's students who need 5. Early on, they often need many exemplars directly taught in order to generalize. Something that helps when you're selecting your exemplars is selecting a full range of exemplars. This is actually one of the principles from direct instruction as well, or effective instruction principles, that when you select exemplars, you want exemplars that are going to represent the full range of them. Meaning, if I'm teaching water bottle, the traditional water bottle, right? That's the one that or pencil, for example. I have the pencil that looks like a typical regular pencil, the yellow pencil that we all know. But then I also have representation of the ones, you know, the water bottle that comes in a swervy shape and it's all fancy and maybe comes in a different color. You want to have that full range, because if you teach the full range, so the examples that are close in to your typical, as well as ones that don't necessarily look like or have the properties of your very traditional exemplar, but are still a water bottle. That's how you would want to do that. Now if you teach several exemplars, 3, 4, whatever it takes for the student, then likely if you did that in your arrangement, they'll be able to get every exemplar in between. So if we do that astutely, now we're having them focus on the critical features of what makes water water versus locking them into just teaching the typical water bottle or water in a clear glass, right? We don't want to do that. So that's why when students start learning parts and features of things, they become a lot stronger at generalizing quickly, because now they can attend to specific parts and features, which does make it easier to get the concept. So basically what we want to do is establish stimulus class. A stimulus class are all the stimuli that get a response, all the different stimuli, and that's how we do it, through multiple exemplar training, okay? Because you want them to generalize to novel exemplars. Then, the way we program, and you'll be seeing this on some of the skills tracking sheets and exemplars I'll show you, the way we program and we lay out our targets, and the targets that we're actually teaching at once, will have a tremendous impact in efficiency in getting to novel responses and generativity. Meaning that the students, for example, there's some skills, and we'll be going over some of these, for example, teaching verb-noun combinations, when you already have students who can tact actions, can tact items, now we're going to teach them to put those together. That shouldn't take very long if we arrange our target selection in a way that's going to result in generalizing that response to any combination of any verb and any noun that they have mastered in their repertoire. Does that make sense? So those are the kinds of things that we directly program for when they're not occurring, but only if the student is ready. And then the other thing that assists with that tremendously is making sure we're exposing students to natural environment training, that we're not stopping at the table, that when we're teaching anything at the table, any possible opportunity we provide students to practice those skills outside of the table are going to result in more likelihood that they're going to then be able to generalize to novel responses and engage in generative responding. We also want to make sure students are responding to all the critical features of something, to all the what means stimuli is all the properties of something, everything that controls the response, including what we say. Including what we say. So, for example, we have many, many students that when you ask them a question such as this, what color, and you're pointing to the blue cap, they say water bottle. Or you say, what is it? They say clear liquid. And they'll give you some response that's within the response class of the water bottle, but excludes what we call our verbal SD. So what we say, they're not responding specifically to what you say, they're simply emitting some response that has been reinforced prior in the presence of this water bottle. But when I ask any of you, what is it, you all respond water bottle. If I say what color, you respond blue. If I say what do you do with it, drink it, right? You don't have those issues because you're able to respond to all the controlling stimuli, including the verbal. That has a fancy term called verbal conditional discrimination, meaning the response is dependent both. It could be all verbal, but it could also be part nonverbal and part verbal, as in this case, when I ask what is it, the response is controlled by both the presence of the water bottle and what I say. So it's dependent upon responding to both, which is why it's called a verbal conditional discrimination, okay? And then, of course, not forgetting to sometimes teach very critical, complex skill sets that don't often arise naturally for kids. They don't get these responses for free in some cases. Some do, but some do not. And we'll go over some of those procedures, such as joint control, where what happens is in joint control, multiple control simply means behaviors that are controlled by more than one antecedent, just like this example. And that could involve, for example, conditional discrimination that has nothing to do with verbal, or verbal conditional discrimination, where now it has to do with one or more verbal antecedents. So that was an example with an item. I could also say something like, name something big you find in the kitchen, and you would respond differently than if I said, name something big you find on the farm. And just by changing farm and kitchen, your response varies, right? So it depends on more than one antecedent. And the big is in both. However, that response changes just by even changing that one verbal SD. So that's multiple control. There's a type of multiple control that's very unique, which is joint control, and we use it extremely often and don't even realize how often we use it, where the multiple parts of the antecedent, some of them are stimuli that we generate ourselves through our own talking and verbal behavior. So for example, when you give someone multiple step directions, so somebody makes a phone call and tells you, well, let me give you a perfect example. This is just awesome. I came down super early because I'm an early riser, set everything up, I did a bunch of stuff, organized to make sure that I had my room ready for when my kids arrive here in the afternoon. Everything's set. And I had bought some props so I can model procedures for you. Well, 2 minutes before the session started, I realized, oh no, I left the bag in my room. So I pick up my phone immediately, because we have a lot of people out there that help, and I call one of my colleagues and I say, Laura, I need you to go in my purse, get my room key. It's going to be in one of the outside pockets, or it might be in my little black purse that's in the big purse. Then you're going to go to my room. There's a brown paper bag. It has all my props, bring it. It's $287. And what did she do? Because I'm spitting this out at her, and it's like 2 minutes to showtime, you know? And she says, okay, purse, side pocket, or little purse, $287, brown paper bag, got it. Because how else on earth would she, from the moment I tell her this to the moment she gets to the second floor, remember my room number, remember where the key was to my room. So that's what's called joint control. What did she do? She repeated it to herself. Key, outside pocket, outside pocket. She goes to my purse. She sees the black purse. And now when her own echoic self-rehearsal matches what she sees and says, she's able to carry out that very complex direction that I gave her. So now she says, keys outside pocket. Now she sees the outside pocket. What she says matches her tack. She reaches in, key is there. And now $287. So now I have to go to the second floor. She enters the key, opens the door, brown paper bag, brown paper bag, boom. And here she comes with her brown paper bag, and now we have it here, so we don't have to worry about not having our props. Okay. So you get the idea. So those are the kinds of skill sets that oftentimes get missed. And what do we try to do? We try to teach multiple step imitation, multiple step directions, using errorless teaching and direct prompts. Well, that's not what we should be doing. We should be teaching students to engage in that type of responding and mediating responses, because that's what gets you novel responding. You can teach some responses. You can teach them. Touch your head, clap your hands, then wave. Stomp your feet, stand up, then open your mouth. And you can teach it through errorless teaching and just model it, they imitate you. At the end, what do you have? 2 sets of 3-step imitation. But if you teach many things they can follow the direction for, you teach many tacks, you teach them to echo and rehearse. Now you can teach them, you can tell them to do 3 things, they can repeat them, rehearse them, and carry them out without you having to teach every single one. And wow, the time we save ourselves, but more importantly, the time we save those students and how much quicker we can get progress when we know to focus on these type of skills. So the other thing, I know you see this often in a lot of our presentations, and I even showed it yesterday during my parent session. If you don't have a good system of instruction that's going to include everything from assessment to teaching procedures, that you have everything planned out, prepared, and you're responding to these, then it's generally not going to result in the most efficient outcome. Even if you're a parent or in-home provider, you should still be thinking about these things. For those of you, I know there's people here who, even though you're not in school settings, you do have formal programs that you either run in homes or in something similar, or in a clinical setting. So what are those important components? First one, assessment. And while the VB map is definitely a critical assessment that we use, don't forget other critical component skills that you have to assess, and don't forget, when applicable, that there are also other assessments that are relevant, such as curriculum-based assessments, right, for students that are ready for that. Assessments in terms of functional daily living skills, vocational skills. For your older students, we have to be thinking, once the student turns 14, you really have to shift your picture to thinking of, what is this student, individual, potentially going to do, and how do I teach the repertoires, assess and teach. Assess whether they have them, and if not, teach the repertoires they're going to need when they get out there into the real life, to be more independent and be able to have a job. That's important. Once you do your assessment, then we select our programs, right? You have the programs you're going to teach. You, of course, go always from easy to hard. And then within each program, you select your targets and you arrange your targets from easiest to hardest. So that's probably one of the most common reasons why imitation fails. Because people start with really easy and then they go to really hard really soon, and the students stall. So they start making quick progress in the beginning and then boom, stall. And those are the things we're trying to avoid with sequencing. Then I know what to teach, but that's worth nothing if I don't know how to teach it. So having clear teaching procedures is another critical component. What to teach, how to teach, but do I have what I need to teach it? So organizations of the material, and another important piece when you're organizing materials is organizing the instructional time, planning for when am I going to teach it. This is why we harp on those classroom schedules for those of you that have classrooms. So at what time and for how long do I teach this skill, right? And then you have all these great things, but how do you know it's working? Well, through your data systems. And of course, the simple, the more efficient, the better. And probably the most critical component of all, if you don't know how to do it, or you don't know when you're making mistakes, then the whole thing could crumble. Even if you have all those other components in place, fidelity of implementation, consistency in doing it right, most of the time, don't go nuts if you made a mistake one day, because we all make mistakes. But when you run things with fidelity, most of the time, you're going to have a better outcome than if everybody's running the procedures differently, they're missing important elements of the procedures, they're making errors, they forget to prompt when it's an errorless procedure. Those are things you want to make sure happen. And then all this just keeps cycling, because then you keep reassessing. You reassess because periodically, generally about every year, you reassess to see where your students are. But that's not the only assessment you do. Once you start teaching, it's a daily assessment of how is this student responding? How does my skill acquisition look? Is it appropriate, or do I need to change what I'm doing because I don't have fast enough acquisition? Okay? So VB-MAP is just one of the assessment tools. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it simply because you're here to learn about the sequence, but for those of you who are less familiar with the VB-MAP, I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about it. One thing that I stress, remember, is that it is not a curriculum. It's not intended for you to take those milestones that you assess and then, if they don't have it, program for that milestone. That's not the intent of the VB-MAP. The intent is for you to assess the milestones, which gives you the big picture of where the student is at. And now, based on the gaps you have, you determine where to start teaching, but it's not necessarily at the gap. It requires analysis. So whichever gaps you have across the operants, you're looking at, okay, I have this gap, but do they have the component skills for this gap? Do they already have what they require to move on to a more difficult skill, or do I need to keep teaching at maybe a criteria level where they might have the milestone met, but they still need more teaching in that area, okay? So those are really important. Of course, as I think most of you are familiar, the VB map assesses first all the verbal operants, so it has a functional approach to behavioral assessment, and in addition to that, it also assesses some other important learning skills. So ability for the child, for example, to sit in a small group and respond, their linguistics, pre-academic skills, social skills, independent play, all those kinds of things are assessed too. So this is just a summary of the information on the VB map. There's a total of 16 milestone areas in the entire assessment. Not all the milestones are present at every level. The VB map has 3 different levels. Level 1, 2, and 3. Level 1 represents, once it's filled, an individual child who has approximately the skill set of about an 18-month-old. Level 2 is 30 months old. Level 3 is 48. This is a moment when people learn this, those who don't know, where you should be thinking, wow, and my student doesn't have the skill set yet of the 30-month, but I'm working on this, and that makes no sense because even a typical developing 30-month-old wouldn't be able to do this. These are the kinds of things you need to start thinking about, okay? Each milestone is quantifiable, so across all the domains and at each level, each milestone has 1 point, and each milestone area has 5 different milestones. So when you total the 16, it's 170 measurable milestones. That's what a full VB map score would be, right? And then there's different milestones at each level. So for example, level 1 has only 9 milestones, which means the highest score you could get if you have level 1 filled and that's the only thing you have is a 45. It's sort of simple the way it works, right? There's 12 at level 2 and then there's 13 at level 3 to give a total of 170 measurable milestones. So level 1, you see the MAND, tact, listener response, visual performance matched to sample, imitation, social, play, echoic, and vocal. Difference between echoic and vocal: vocal refers to spontaneous vocalizations versus echoic under the control of someone else. So what you see at level 2 is that the vocal drops out. Why? Because after 18 months of age, most of what children are saying are to interact with another person. It becomes social behavior, all of it, even if that other person is themselves. Where they start engaging in responses, but even when they're playing on their own and they're talking, it's because they're pretending to be like, oh, do you want some tea to the bear? And then they, pretend the bear responds, and that's more the behavior you start teaching. So all that, the babbling, the vocalizing, just randomly because they're just repeating things that other people say just because they're reinforcing, already drop from there. But all the other skill sets are the same. Then when you get to level 3, the gaps that you see here, in addition to that vocal, are imitation and echoic. Because by the age of 3, by 30 months old, most children out there will imitate almost everything they see and hear. This is why almost every parent has been through at least one ultra embarrassing moment when their child has spit out in public something that when they say that, they were carrying all their little toys and you were at, your aunt's house who happens to be very conservative and strict, and all of a sudden your child drops all the toys and everything goes everywhere and she says, oh, you can fill in the blank. And you go, and it's like you just see everything black. You don't know where to go, what to do. It's even worse when it happens in your workplace take your child to work day. And everybody's eyes, it doesn't go to the child, it goes to you. Because everybody knows they had to have heard it from you. Don't you try to blame it on TV and YouTube. We all know that's the case. And then you go back home and say, Charlie, we need to be really careful what we say in front of Marla. You don't know what happened to me today, right? And yet, how many students do we have who don't have generalized echoic and imitative repertoires? And again, the echoic would be an exception in the sign, or it would be more imitation. But think about, this is why children between those ages of like 24 and 30 months become sponges. And the growth in their skill sets, it's dramatical from the age of, for example, when they just turned 2 to when they're now 30, 35, 36 months. And you just start, oh my goodness, and look, and every day you can't even keep track of what they learn anymore. Early on, it's easy to keep track. You know, even if you have a typical developing child, you know everything they can say, you know everything they can do. And then all of a sudden, that goes out of control. That's how we're teaching, so that it goes out of control for our students, and we don't have to teach everything anymore, and we can't keep track of what they know. So here are the guidelines for programming. General, regardless of what level the student is. You complete your VE map. You then define your general level. So for example, you have a child with a score of 36. You all know it's a level 1, right? The highest score is a 45. Even if they have some scattered skill set at level 2 or 3, that's irrelevant when you have so many gaps at the bottom and you don't have those component skills. You have a student with a score of 98, you know they have some skills at level 2, and so on and so forth, right? So you determine whether you have your level 1 learner, an emerging 2, a solid 2, emerging 3, you get the idea. But at all times, we're looking to build depth within each milestone and breadth across the operands, that you want to teach students to respond across all the possible ways to respond to something. So when you teach that water bottle, initially, you want them to be able to demand for the water, meaning ask for it. You want them to be able to tack the water when they see it, and if they're asked to label it. You want them to be able to get a bottle of water if you say, get the water. Eventually, once they are ready for that, you want them to be able to respond water when you say, hey, tell me something that you drink. Name something you drink. And can the child say water? Can they say water when you say water, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you want them to respond across all operands, but also within it, depth. That when I'm teaching those tags for items, when I'm teaching water, the depthness of, I want you to have the concept, not just the response for this water bottle. And when I'm teaching tags, I also want you to have many tags, and I want you to learn novel tags very easily without me having to run 57 trials. Okay? So that's important. So we analyze the score, and then we determine what skill sets we're going to teach based on not only just the gap, but again, reminders. These are kind of your two different kind of primary criteria that you look at. First, do I have the component skills for what I need? Do I have enough of what they have? What is enough? Generalized responses and fluent. These are not things they're making a lot of errors for. If you have a student that you're thinking of teaching another more complex or another aspect of things like actions or parts, and it's still taking them a long time to acquire, that the other one is acquisition rates, a long time to acquire new tags, or the ones that they have, they're erring on often, or they haven't generalized, then we're not ready to move on. Because now you're going to add more complexity to your program where you still have trouble with the basic component skill. So basically, criteria on the VE map, food for thought, they do not imply that the student has that skill set mastered. They imply that they met that milestone, which gives you a sense that they have some skills there, but now we have to dig in to see whether they actually have the skill mastered or if we need to continue programming for that skill set, okay? So once we select our programs, we select the targets for instruction. And then everybody asks, well, how do I know what targets to select? Always from easy to hard, and very importantly, what's relevant to the student. We're going to give some, I'm going to, not we here, there's no more than one person, I don't know why I keep saying we. You know why? Because I represent a we, because I work with so many incredible consultants, and we're all a team, and we all learn from each other, so that's why I say we. It's not because I haven't mastered my pronouns yet. So we want to select our targets where they're relevant to the student. You don't want to teach just randomly, like, oh, I have a picture of a microphone here, let me introduce this. Well, if your student is a mirrorist, you'd want to introduce microphone because it turns out she loves to sing, right? But if it's irrelevant for the student and he still doesn't know what a battery is and needs batteries for a lot of things he uses, then battery would be more relevant. So make sure it's relevant. And what are the guidelines for relevance? Well, things that are valuable to the student, because there's nothing more relevant to any of us than what's valuable to us, right? That's the major relevant. You also want to prioritize things that are very common in their day-to-day life, meaning they're going to encounter these things all the time. You don't go many places where you don't see a chair. You don't go by a day that you don't see a shoe generally, or a shirt, or a plate, or a spoon, or a cup, or a ball, or a book, or a sink, and go on and on and on and on. Go with the common. When you go with the common, don't just think about those common items in households. Think about the common items in the school setting as well. Do they know what a folder is, a ruler, everything that they would need to know? Would I prioritize ruler for a child who barely has any tax? Probably not, because I would want them to have the most common first. But oftentimes teachers are like, oh, they already mastered the box. We ended the TAC program because they have the box. Well, if that box is all they have, you're in trouble. So think outside the box, because that box, and by the box, you all know I'm referring to the Language Builder card box. Everybody's familiar with them. Has 350 cards. The first 105 are multiple exemplars of the first few things, and then from there on, you have single pictures. So now you're on one exemplar, and then you're in real big trouble. So that's all you're tied to. And I tell you, that box doesn't have a ruler. It doesn't have a folder. It doesn't have a snowman. It doesn't have a tray. It doesn't have a spatula. It doesn't have a sponge. It doesn't have a measuring cup. It doesn't have measuring spoons. Do you want me to keep going? Because it's a lot it doesn't have. A lot of relevant things. So make sure you're not tying yourself to that box or thinking even remotely that that child has sufficient tax, because first of all, it's not 350, wake-up call. And second, that's nowhere near sufficient. Any 2.5, 3-year-old has 300 tax. That's nothing. How do you survive with that repertoire? In addition to the common, and again, tied to also things they see in school in their community, think of the gen ed curriculum, the things that the other students are being exposed to. And it doesn't mean you have to teach everything as complex, but to the extent possible, what tax can I teach that are going to be relevant, that also increase their opportunities for meaningful participation, or at least to engage in similar activities in the classroom that you adapt. And now you're addressing that accessing the gen ed curriculum appropriately, because you're informed. You're talking to the gen ed teachers to find out what they're teaching. That's another good one. And then this is another big one. You want to make sure you're teaching tax or any skills when you're selecting any targets that are going to promote social interactions. So for example, if you only teach what's valuable to the student and not what's valuable to other students, let me tell you, a one-way conversation never lasts very long. People walk away from me because I like to talk too much, and generally I dominate the conversation. Eventually they get tired and walk away. So I take this advice for myself. So seriously, how many of you have that friend like me who just talks and talks and talks, and you can't get a word in edgewise, or only wants to talk about the things they like to talk about? I really don't. I mean, I listen to Mike talk about birds all the time. I do, right? Dean's been with me there, and he's seen it, man. I'm a good friend. But if I didn't have some repertoire around birds, I mean, I can't tell you how happy Mike gets when I say, wow, Mike, look at that turkey vulture, especially because he knows he taught that to me, because I only knew parakeet, pigeon, dove, canary, whatever you saw in the cartoons or I saw on the streets of New York when I was a child. That was my repertoire. Cockatoo, I knew that one too. Other than that, that was my repertoire of birds. I'm done there. And the eagle. Okay, I know the eagle. Eagle, I learned that, right? Because it represents our country. So, other than that, like I remember Mike, when I first met him, he's like, wow, look at that goldfinch. Where's the gold? I don't see a ring here. And I know all these repertoires now, this large repertoire of birds. Why? Because if I can't reinforce Mike when he's talking about birds, he's not going to want to talk to me a lot. And you know what? I appreciate that dude. He's an awesome guy. So you have to make sure you're teaching what's valuable to others as well, okay? And then last but not least, the ones that are going to promote most independence. So again, both in your program selection and your target selection, you're looking at targets that are going to promote independence. This is why we don't promote writing goals or targeting skills where you have to write out something like, can perform X within no more than X prompts. That's a little bit concerning in my opinion, because if they're prompted, it means they're not doing it, which means they can't do it yet. which means it's not an established skill, period. But why do people do that? Because they're stuck with a student in front of them. They don't know how to have them make progress because they can't, so at least let's have them acquire something with a prompt. And that's where the sequencing comes in, that when you have students especially who are really struggling because they're super early learners, they come in with like a blank slate, people struggle with how do we get this initial skill set established. We have to make sure it's consistent with their response form, right? Whether it's vocal, sign, whichever the response form is. As many of you know, if the student is using a selection-based response form, then that would be the case where you wouldn't be programming for intraverbals and tacs. So you know that you aren't programming for those unless you're using a selection-based system for one thing and then using sign for the tacs. And then, of course, you want to have your materials available because we learned a little earlier how important that is. In addition to that, then you also immediately want to organize your systems. We have videos on the patent website that you can access with a detailed explanation of this, so I'm not going to go over it ad nauseum. It's just general information that you need. So what do you need? First, to organize your data systems. So what we use is generally for each active program a skills tracking sheet that keeps track of the skills the student has mastered, those that you're targeting, and then future targets that are ready to go so that you don't waste time when they master something going on to your next skill. A cumulative graph for each of the active programs, and I'll talk to you a little bit about that in a second. Probe sheets, which is where we assess the ones that we're teaching every day. And then we also organize allocation of instruction. So that's the schedule. If you're in a classroom, at each interval of the day, who is each staff with? What are they teaching? Where are they teaching it? So they know all the instruction where it gets planned for. And then finally, the materials you're going to teach with. So the cumulative graph, the cumulative graph is going to assist with the following. When you're looking at skills tracking sheets, you had a student who started with you X date and now it's several months later. How do you know how much progress they've made? Well, yes, you can count the skills on your skills tracking sheet, which would take a lot of counting, and when you have a lot of skills, that's very tedious, and it doesn't give you a quick read. The benefit of the graph is it gives you a quick representation of the total number of cumulative skills a student has within that skill area. The way you arrange cumulative graphs is the following manner. Comes here. I'm going to put it there because you don't need to see that. So on this axis, you see it says total number of skills mastered, and then on this axis, it's the days of instruction, right? These are the days of the month. These graphs, by the way, are available if anybody's interested, just on our resource file. They're already pre-done for the whole 18-19 school year with all the holidays, weekends blocked out. So you have, here you started at 0. This means a skill was mastered. When a skill is mastered, it goes up 1 dot. Can you scale your graph differently? Yes. If you notice here, each of these lines represents 1. Here's a 5, 10, 15, 20. Each line in between represents 1. I would strongly advise this is how you have your graphs rather than having differently scaled graphs, because then when they're scaled differently, one of your graphs is scaled where each line is 1, the other one, each line is 2, and now people start making errors when they're graphing. Whereas if you keep it consistent, then you can have consistent graphing across all staff, and you can teach everyone, even people who hate graphs, how to graph. Kindergartners learn how to graph, so you can't tell me staff in your classroom can't graph, okay? So each dot goes up 1. So if we look at this skills tracking sheet, student has acquired thus far 4 tacs. But when you assess your students, if your students come in with already a baseline, so let's say you assess them, they already had 37 tacs, you start your graph where they already have 37 plotted, okay? So what would that graph look like? Your graph always starts at 0. You just put these little break lines here that'll represent that there's a break between that and your next interval. And then this line would be 40. And now if it was 37, I plot my dot here. If this one is 40, this would be 37, right? And like that, you keep altering your scale as you move on, but you keep it scaled at 1 per skill, and that makes it easy then to keep track. But the good thing about it is that it gives us a really quick visual analysis. When students aren't making progress and you see that line flat, you should be changing what you're doing. You should be trying to figure out why that line is flat and do something about it. It shouldn't be flat because they've been absent all those days, because you don't plot dots when there's no opportunities to teach. Those would be absentee, no instruction days. That would be blacked out just like a holiday or just like a weekend, okay? This is what your cold probe sheet looks like. The cold probe sheet basically will have listed your targets. This is just as an example. This column, because I know it's small, is the number of days active. This one, why is that? You don't have to do that. Some of the teachers like it, because I'll tell you, if you see a number 38 there, that should be a little bit concerning. Okay? This has your operand, then the skill, the target within that operand that you're teaching, prior yeses. So has the student gotten any yeses the last week that I need to carry over? I'll explain that further. And then here's where you jot whether they responded correctly or not, first time in the day without teaching. And then if they get at least 3 consecutive yeses in a row for most skills, we consider that skill mastered. Okay? That's what that looks like. Because it's 3 consecutive teaching days, opportunities of teaching days, if the student, for example, had a yes on Friday, then we would, but not on Thursday, we would carry over a number 1 to that previous yes column. And now we only need 2 more. If they had yeses on Thursday, Friday, we carry a number 2. If they had a yes Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, it would have been mastered, so we carry nothing over. We enter a new skill. And then the way we organize our materials is as follows. One way to shortcut this is, as you're assessing, if you have your materials for assessment pre-ready. For example, I'm assessing tax. I have my stack of picture cards. I'm presenting them to a student. I may be mixing in other things. Everyone that's correct, I put to my right. Everyone incorrect, I put to my left. Now I'm automatically getting this all set. If I have pre-made a bunch of LR directions, everyone they get correct, I put to the right. Everyone that they get incorrect, I put to the left. Now at the end, I have all of my easy materials for the student, and I have all of my future targets for the student already organized. Those are shortcuts that people don't tell you about. Like, it's like a big secret, but it could be a lot easier than assessing, writing down a million things, and now having to go scrounge to make the materials for your student. That's why assessment kits are good, but I'd rather have the materials for the student to assess with and assess them with the own materials I'm preparing for them, so that then you're efficient because now you have all your materials done. So the way the system works for intensive teaching, and this does not include, I'm going to talk about a little in detail of what happens when students don't have any skills that you can make cards for. So there's picture cards and there's 3x5 cards. The picture cards are for tacting, LR discrimination, selecting named items. There's a big rat back there. And the 3x5 cards are for anything the teacher would present that does not have some stimulus to it that's going to guide their instruction. So for example, following instructions, right? LR, listen to responses that are following directions, imitation, intraverbals. The reason I don't have this on the PowerPoint and you don't have to worry about taking notes, I included in the Groupio app as well as on the website, if you want to access it through that, there's a folder that says resources for session 74, and that has all of these things, including the description of how you develop the card sort, everything. There's about probably like 20, if not more, documents in there that include the data sheets that I'm going to be showing. It'll have also like the materials organization, and they're available also on our resource file. So all of the things like intraverbals, echoics, imitation, those would all be written on cards. I'll show you what they look like. And then when you're assessing, the easiest way to do it is you would already pre-make them so that you can then present them. Anything they know you put on one side, you keep the others on the other side, right? If when you assess them, they're already easy, then you wouldn't, on your skills tracking sheet, which is where we keep, skills introduced, skills mastered, instead of putting introduce and date mastered, you would put the date and just put assessed or probed out. And now you know they came with those skills. You would only do that if they only had a few skills within that skill area, because if they came in with 257, you're not going to go and write skills tracking sheets for all of that. You would just say C assessment, and you already have all your easy materials, so you're good to go. And then for your target skills, it would be the same idea. You develop you make sure you have pictures ready as well as future 3x5, so now you have enough materials to always have the ones you need to teach today, and at least several other extra for each of the skill sets, so that you don't have to waste time making materials when the student masters something. Now you have it all pre-planned. This is an example of what those cards might look like. So for example, the echoic, they're color-coded, and what winds up happening is the colors start becoming SDs. The SD is the antecedent that basically controls our response, because the history is that in the presence of this, reinforcement has occurred when I respond like this, okay? So this is what signals reinforcement is available. So that's what these are. They're SDs. But some SDs are not a picture. They're things we, as the teacher, say. So for example, if I want the student to follow a direction like touch your nose, that would be my verbal SD. But what winds up happening is eventually, because that listener response is always tied to that pink card, the echoic is always tied to the yellow. I don't even have to say ba to know that I have to say ba, because I already know yellow is echoic. As soon as I see ba, I present it as an echoic. So your instruction becomes so much more efficient because of that. Interverbals, just for the record, so echoic on yellow, tax on green, LRs on pink, motor imitation on purple, interverbals on blue with the picture right behind it, but you would only do this, and I'll show you why, because we're going to go over this program, for interverbals that have a single response. So you wouldn't do this for something like tell me something with a door, because there's a lot of things with doors. But if it's a single response, we have the picture right and back, because that's how we prompt it, and that's how if we have to correct it, that's what we do. And then we organize them in bins. This is a bin, of course, of a student who's already had instruction for a little bit. But the reason I put them here is, if you notice, there's 2 boxes of picture cards, there's 1 entire box of 3x5 cards, and a few months later, there was a 3rd picture box and more of the 3x5s. The reason I put this up here is because oftentimes I'll go to classrooms and teachers will say, I think this student is bored of IT. They're not students who are learning new skills within 1 or 2 trials, but yet, and they have, on record, tons of tax for items, etc., but their card store is in a box this big. Well, of course they're going to be bored. It means you're going through that box 70 times a day, the same things. And it means you're also not practicing a lot of things they learned before. So those are the same teachers that report, he's regressed. We were in the cafeteria, and he didn't know what a tray was anymore. Well, you don't even have a picture of a tray, and he hasn't seen it in 70 years. You understand? So it's important that we have variety, because, of course, they're going to get sick. You're going to get sick of the same materials. And then the way you organize it is, these are all the easies. Basically, let me see when that looks clear. Okay, right here, you see a card that pops out. That card says, start over. Shuffle it and start over. What happens is, when you're presenting your items, you select from the front a pack when you're going to present your teaching. You do your intensive teaching. When you finish, because you've been flipping the ones you do over, you take the ones you flipped over that were done, they go in the back, all the way in the back behind that start over card. The ones you didn't stay in the front, if you didn't get to all of them. When this card reaches the front, it means you've gone through all your materials, and now you shuffle all the cards so you don't always present the deer after the table and the student's saying deer before you even bring the card out. It's these little things that people don't tell us, because we need to teach to respond flexibly, okay? So here we go in terms of establishing our initial repertoire. And actually, it's 10:15. Let's go. Can we do 15 more minutes? Perfect. Somebody said yes. So I just looked at one person that I thought would say yes, and because I knew she would say yes, I'm going with it. So establishing level 1 skills. Okay, here are our level 1 learners. Who are these learners? These are the learners where, when we do an assessment, if we're lucky, this is what it looks like. Basically, they generally come in with hardly any or no mans, same for the tact, very poor or very limited imitation. So their skill sets, they come in with pretty much almost nothing. And these are the types of students that most people struggle with, because when they have at least a little bit and they just have delays, then it becomes a little bit easier because you have a base to start with. But when you have no base, how do I get the base so that I can prompt the others? But here, it's like you have nothing to prompt with, and they seem to be the biggest challenge for most people. So it's not uncommon to see students who don't have any of these skills, or they're very, very limited or very constricted, and you start implementing programs, a whole year goes by, and you've gotten no progress. Because we're trying to teach skills that are too hard in relation to how most students come to us, which is with generally a little more than what we see here, at least a couple mans, a few tacts. They have more behavior than more responses than we see here. So one of the issues is that while the VB map is helpful for these students, it doesn't suffice, because these are students where we have to go below the VB map to assess, to see where we start. What are those assessments that we see, that we use? Number one, approach frequencies. So how often does the student approach people? Why? We need to know if people are valuable. And if they're not, we need to work on it. Because if they want nothing to do with people, then it's going to be really hard to establish any repertoire, okay? Second, observational responses. So what happens when there's something that moves, when a sound comes, when something is placed in front of them? Do they look? Do they reach? Do they touch it? Are they attending to things that happen in the environment? And that's what we call observational responses. Do they turn their head when a noise comes from this side or somebody says something? So those are the things you're looking for in terms of that, okay? Then another important one, along with do they approach people, are there things that are valuable? What are their preferred items? What are the things they gravitate towards? What are the things they spend time with? What are the things they approach frequently? Because how do we establish new skill sets when you have none without having anything to reinforce those behaviors with? If we don't serve as valuable yet, how do we get that student to come to us if we have nothing to have them come to us with? That's a problem. So we look for potential items that are going to serve as reinforcers. And then the other one is response variability. Basically, what are the different behaviors this child engages in, regardless of our involvement? So if you put, for example, one of those marble ball things and there's a ball there, will they pick it up and put it down the marble ramp? Will they take a car and roll it back and forth? If there's a toy with a big button, will they push the button? If there's a little keyboard, will they push the piano key? If there's one of those balls that comes like on a stand, will they spin the ball? So you're looking, if there's a container that's closed, that's open, will they close the lid, and vice versa, will they open it? There's a book in front of them, do they take it and open the book? Anything that they do, even if it's just through manipulating things, regardless of what you do, you're looking to assess, to try to get an idea for the variability in the way they respond. How many different movements can they engage in? With how many different things do they do it with? And then I'll show you what that looks like in the data sheets. And all the data sheets are available for you in that file that I put together for you. So what are the most common programming issues with these students, and why do we get stuck with them? Well, primary reasons are the following. First, because they have such limited skills, and it's so hard to establish those initial repertoires of talking, meaning manding, tacting, or even echoic responses, or even teaching sign initially. Because there's such a struggle, what do people tend to do? They might be able to do a couple inset puzzles. Now they puzzle them up the wazoo. We're going to do a lot of puzzles. We're going to do a lot of matching. We're going to do a lot of nonverbal responses that I can physically prompt you through. And that tends to be, it's like, well, I can't get this, so let me program for this instead. And there's not enough consideration given, enough emphasis to teaching verbal responses, right? So that's one big problem, not teaching verbal behavior. The challenge of selecting a response form. The student has poor imitation skills. The student has no vocal behavior. The student can't discriminate anything. So how do they respond? This is why these students often come to us with problem behavior, right? Because that's the only way they can respond, by crying or doing other things that get people's attention and get them access to things. And then these are generally students for the following reason. I mentioned this before also. When you have a child who has such limited repertoires, the behaviors that all young babies, even infant, like just a 6-month-old baby already has imitative responses, already has interactions with another person. And because they lack those skill sets, the ability to interact with other people and other things such as toys is diminished drastically. Therefore, they often come along with limited reinforcers because they have no interest in the toys because they don't have the behaviors to have the toy do what it's supposed to do, so they don't get to experience that cause effect, that reinforcement that's produced that other children get because they're able to engage in all those responses, right? And similar to people, they might not value people or approach people because they don't have the behaviors that allow other children to get responses from adults and get reinforced. So what happens is this generally results, and I'm just going to say it frankly, this is my conclusion of how this happens, but based on the core deficits of a child with autism or a significant developmental delay, and based on the knowledge that, for example, how do we make an autism diagnosis? It's behavioral primarily, right? And this is the reason. So if we know all this, then that has to have a significant impact, and this is why so many of these students come with limited reinforcers, stereotypical behaviors, because if I can't entertain myself by playing with this toy, I have to do something else to entertain myself if other things do not produce reinforcement for me. A lot of us engage in stereotypical behaviors, they just don't look odd. But we engage in a variety of things. Some of us do this, some of us tap our feet, some of us shake our leg, some of us do this constantly, some of us pick our fingers, but we do it discreetly, right? Because we understand social appropriateness. So just something to think about, because if we focus then on building things that are valuable for the student and making ourselves valuable, then we can start getting more things that serve as reinforcers for the student. So earliest at level 1, at the earliest phase of level 1, here's what we want to do. First thing, biggest thing, establishing instructional control and approach behavior. We don't want students running away from us. If they're running away from us, you're not going to be very effective. If you find yourselves putting that child in a small chair, sitting in front of them and locking them in with your knees so they don't leave, you know you're in a bad place to start teaching. Because an unwilling learner never learns the same as a willing learner. That's why you all learn so much at this conference, because you're here willingly, because you want to learn. And there's a difference when learning is valuable to you than when it's not, right? So the other thing we want to establish is saliency of the stimulus that's around them. So we want to make sure they can attend to speaker, attend to the materials. Those initial repertoires that we often overlook very early on because most students come with them. Most students, when you put something in front of them, they look. But these are students that oftentimes don't even have those responses. So how do we get those responses to occur? So what do we tend to do? This student has no ability to scan and look at things, and we're trying to teach them to match or to discriminate or select an item when we name it. Well, you can't select an item, let alone select and discriminate from other things when I hear a specific name of an item. So now we're teaching too much, too hard, all at once. And that's oftentimes why that progress fails. That's just a couple of examples of that. The pool of reinforcers, of course, making sure that we both identify, but if we don't have enough, if we don't have a good array of things that can serve as valuable, you know what winds up happening? You have only 1 or 2 things that this student finds valuable and you immediately try to start teaching. Eventually, they're going to habituate to those. If it's inedible, there's only so many things they can consume before they get tired of it. Well, some of them are, that's not the case. I mean, my daughter can eat Oreos till she turns like an Oreo into an Oreo. But the bottom line is, and even if it's a toy, I mean, you can be entertained by something, but there's only so long that you're engaged in something before you habituate to it. And now this isn't, you kind of lose your mojo for it, you know? There's no value to it if you're doing the same thing over and over again. And then the first programs we teach are, oftentimes we have to directly program for approach behaviors. You're going to see what that looks like. Man training would be the very first also, because if they can't control their environment in any way, if they can't ask for what they want when they need it, when it's of value, that's the one verbal operant that's the most valuable to the speaker, because it directly benefits them. I want something, I say that something, and I get that something. That's like powerful. So it oftentimes establishes that talking is a good thing, and now it makes it easier to teach other operants, right? Imitation skills, because then it has such value in teaching other skills, and eventually in building to a really good, strong imitative repertoire that's generalized, that now they can learn new things without you having to teach it in the long run. That's your goal. Tacting, which is critical as soon as possible. Sometimes in the very beginning, this is not possible simply because they don't have the baseline skills to start tacts. So for example, if they cannot say what you say, or they cannot engage in the movement you engage in, how do you teach the tact? You can't. So you have to establish the initial repertoires first, but then as soon as possible, bring in your tact. Match to sample can often serve early on as just another varied skill. It's a critical skill, especially in most academic learning. However, it's not that it's the most urgent skill to teach, because it comes easily once you've taught scanning and discrimination, but it's not complex to teach. It's fairly easy when you're teaching identical things. Therefore, it can help with having variety of things you do when you have very limited skills, because one of the reasons that instruction becomes tough is you hardly have anything to do, so now you wind up doing the same things over and over. So that can add variability in responding into your program. And then doing listener responses, but that they're in context. They're not listener responses that are going to be solely controlled by what you say. They're partially going to be controlled also by the items, which in addition to what you say, control their response. What does that mean? If I have a big toy in front of me with a big button, the child tends to push that button when they see that toy. Now I bring out the toy, and on baseline assessment, when I say push the button, they might have not done it, but if they already have the response when they're on their own, it'll be a lot easier for me to establish instructional control that they respond to what I say when I put that item and say, push the button, and now have them push it. Because the context controls it, they're a lot more likely to get it easier, okay? So with that said, I still have 2 more minutes, hold on. No, let me be really good, and I'll send you for your break. Let's take 10 minutes and come back, okay? And we'll keep going. We'll continue on for the sake of time, right? So, what we're going to talk about now is just man training. We already know the importance of man training. I sort of talked about it already, right? Teaches students to control their environment. Quite frankly, who would not be in a happier place from going where you can't ask for anything to being able to ask for things? I mean, you see the immediate change oftentimes when you start teaching the student those first few mans, and it's like a transformation because, wow, finally I can do something that's easy to do and get good stuff. That's just easy. It makes it simple. So it's a great entry point for developing verbal repertoires, as I was mentioning. If you start by teaching students how to label, how to tag things, right? Labeling, tagging items isn't going to be as valuable for them than manding, because for manding, what they say is what they get. There's direct motivation tied to whatever they're saying, and that's why mands is the one verbal operant that benefits the speaker directly, right? So, things that you want to keep in mind when you're establishing these initial mand repertoires, and these rules apply to almost everything you teach in terms of scheduling enough opportunities. So when we get to other operants, I'm not going to mention that because that goes for everything you do at every level. Do you have enough opportunities to teach? Are you providing trials of mands across motivational classes, meaning it's not only edibles or it's not only toys? Most people tend to get stuck between things they like to eat and objects, like toys or tangible things. And they forget about the most important category, which is the social reinforcers. All the things that only come through you, because those are the ones that you only control, they can't get it without you, and will increase your value. What are social reinforcers? Anything, it doesn't have to be physical. It can involve physical, but everything from you singing to them, making goofy noises. I mean, I know one student in particular, he actually was in a school district where some of the participants here will know exactly who I'm talking about. And one of his biggest reinforcers were if you got close to his ears and went, wah, and he just thought it was the best thing on the planet. You know, I remember doing that out of desperation, just trying to get this kid to giggle. And I mean, I became his BFF. Every time I would walk into that classroom, he would just come running to me because I had the wah. So, but the reason I show you that is those are the things we don't even think about. So just let yourself go. Let your hair down and go. Have fun and come up with novel things that you've never seen before. Be goofy because you never know what, it could be some goofy movement you made and you went pop and all of a sudden that caught them and that was something of value. So don't be hesitant. So it includes anything that you do as well as all those kind of physical social reinforcers like tickles and hugs and bounces and wiggling the arms and cracking the egg on the head and tickling them down and the drills and anything. Squeeze head if they like those things. This is where all those sensory things, that's where you bring them in, people. If they do have those that value that sensory tactile because they value that input, then this is where you use it. Don't schedule 30 minutes in the day where they're going to get all of it all together and now you lost all those opportunities to have them ask for things throughout the day. Give it throughout the day. Use it to establish man repertoires. Use it as reinforcement. That's how you want to use those. So make sure you're always checking for motivation, of course. If you don't have motivation, if nothing is of value at the time, then get to work and trying to get it to be valuable. How do you get it to be valuable? Just sell it, people. Just like they sell us the commercials, right? You're not going to make it valuable by doing this. Slinky? He didn't want it. Well, no kidding. Who would want something like that? But if I go, woohoo, Slinky, whoo, now you're having fun. I want that. I mean, any child, what does the child always want? What the other child that's having fun has. They could have a ball, and they want that other ball because they see that child giggling in with the ball. So those are just ways, and there's a ton of advice for how to do that. But just bottom line, one of the easiest ways to do it is have fun. Just have fun. It's that simple. And in addition to that, vary the way you do things all the time. So if I am going to say, woohoo, Slinky, if I do that 10 times in a row, that woohoo becomes white noise. So you have to vary the way you present reinforcers, okay? Make sure that you're using good teaching procedures and correction procedures so you have a defined way to prompt demands, you have a defined way to fade those prompts, and again, those are principles that go across anything you're teaching. Avoid generalized demands, meaning demands that control more than one reinforcer. What are these generalized demands? More, please, help, I want. Some students do this, want, and then the parent goes around trying to find what they want and until they get whatever it is, and that's what serves as it. But more what? Now you're in the same boat, because what happens is they come up to you, they sign more or say more, and now you don't know what the more is, so now you're scrounging too, and if you take too long, what do you get? The same problem behavior you got before they had the more. Okay? More develops pretty early on in typical developing children, but when you don't have a man repertoire, then it can definitely impede the acquisition of specific mans, which is why you don't want to do that, right? And sometimes we accidentally do that, not because we're teaching things like more or help, but because we're teaching only one man, and then that one man becomes what they do for everything because they learn, I do this when I want something, versus learning discrimination of different responses for different motivation, which is what you want to establish. You also want to avoid chaining extraneous behaviors. So many of the students, especially when one has not been careful to pay attention to these things, before every man, here's one of the things you see common. When do you see that? Students where prompt procedures have not been faded, or where they always reach first, then ask. So when you get those kind of things very early on, just put those hands in neutral. Make sure you're not reinforcing those. You're always getting the hands to neutral, prompting the responses in the position their hands should be if they're signers, when they ask for things. If they're vocal, make sure those hands are neutral when you're prompting, because you don't want a child constantly going and then asking for something, okay? This is a really important one early on, guys, really important. Make sure the target you select to teach is easy enough for them to perform. So one of the most common reasons for failure of acquiring man repertoires is that the behavior selected, the response selected, is too difficult for them to say or do if it's a sign. And that's one of the common problems. So this is a place where definitely shaping processes using adapted signs initially are always a good idea. And I'll talk to you about that as well. And then, of course, sequence carefully. Be careful not to move too quickly to try to get more words, increase mean length of utterance. That's not our priority. Which is better? A child who can say, I want blank, who actually has no idea what I want is supposed to do to the listener. When you teach things like that, that's when you don't get, let's go to the store and get a big raft so we can come to the beach, blow it up, and I can ride the waves. You don't get that when you're teaching, I want water, I want shoe, especially if you add the please to it. That's the student that winds up, I want pour the more water on the cup, please, thank you. And we see it all the time because people are moving too fast to try to get the student to speak in more complex ways when they still don't even have enough things they can ask for. They're still having a hard time learning new things to ask for, and we're adding complexity to it. It's not once or twice that I see people, students who have less than 15 mans in their repertoire, and they're working on trying to get them to do phrases. And that's not the best idea. Go where you have the biggest bang for your buck. Go for establishing so many mans that you lose track of what they have, okay? And what's your goal? To get to the place where they're learning new mans quickly, okay? So, when we're teaching the first mans, I mentioned this, shaping is going to be critical. Shaping is what we use when we have a child who, for example, cannot engage in the end response. And because they can't engage in the end response, then we select some kind of approximation to teach, and then we give better reinforcement every time the child can get closer to the adult form. And as they get closer to the adult form, the ones that are less proximate, we don't reinforce anymore. So it's a combination of those principles of differential reinforcement, better reinforcement for better responding, and extinction, which is no longer reinforcing, and the behavior fades. So you use extinction for the less proximate responses, differential reinforcement for the closer ones, and then you get a better result in accomplishing your goal of getting to the best possible response. What you're looking for as a best possible response is the response that most people are going to understand. So with that said, sometimes when people are selecting responses to teach as an adapted sign, the adapted sign they select is so foreign from the adult form that how would you ever shape it into what it should be? So try to select adaptations that are going to be similar to the adult form, so eventually you can get there once they have more skills. So for example, you wouldn't want to teach a student to man for music by patting their belly, because music is over here. So if anything, just tap the arm. That's easy to do, because this can be later on at least turned into this, and eventually turned into this if possible. Does that make sense? So you want the adaptation to occur where it's some kind of part of the end behavior that you're trying to shape. And then, as I mentioned, you don't want to teach only one at a time, because if you do, you accidentally wind up teaching generalized man. So bare minimum, you're going to have 2 targets. Okay, that's your bare minimum. Generally, man targets are 3 to 5, but we have found a few students that very early on, sometimes we have to bring it down to only 2, and then everything else we just give it for free and say it when we're giving it, because it's so hard for them to learn those early discriminations that it's just one from the other. It sometimes helps with having more opportunity for teaching trials and getting your first ones to be acquired. And then always, 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 even if the student cannot talk, they might not be able to talk, but they can hear. So don't forget to model the vocal response form. So every time we're delivering reinforcement, every time we're modeling a sign for them, every time we're prompting them, we're also saying it. This has a twofold benefit. One, they hear the name of the item right before that reinforcer comes every single time, which is the principle of conditioning. So oftentimes, that's how typical developing children start emitting their first sounds. The sound in and of itself of the word becomes valuable. It's conditioned. And oftentimes, that's why you start seeing students who talk first without us suspecting it when we're doing men training and we're always modeling the response form, because saying it, the sound of it, is reinforcing. So you always say it. And don't forget that the students can hear, okay? So not only is it conditioned because it's paired with the delivery of reinforcer, but it's also going to help with possibly getting the vocalization to occur because of the reinforcing value that it acquires. So the next thing we do is we fade our prompt systematically, right? So there's different ways that we fade our prompt. Those of you who have been through any kind of man training, you know that there's two basic ways to fade our prompts. One would be what we call, there's two possible ways. Remember, a man trial is, in simple terms, want something, say it, get it. Meaning motivation, say it, right, the behavior, and then the consequence, which is the reinforcer. So the trial ends when you deliver the reinforcer. There's two ways to fade your prompt. One would be before the reinforcer is delivered. The other one is after. So because of that, you have two different types of trials. The within trial transfer, it's within the same trial. If the trial ends when the reinforcer is delivered, it means we fade before it ends. So that's the one where student wants a slinky, you model it slinky, but instead of just giving it to them when they say it, after they say it, now you move it a little bit closer, which serves as a little bit of reinforcement, but now you're using a little extinction, a little time delay, which generally results in magnitude and variability early on. So now they say slinky again, and then you deliver it, okay? That's your within trial transfer. The second trial transfer would be where you end the trial, and then you go for a second trial without the prompt. So slinky, student says slinky, you give the slinky, woohoo, and now they say, you bring it up again, they say slinky independently, now they get more bounces of the slinky. They get better reinforcement because they said it more independently. You have to have some way to distinguish how you reinforce more independent responses, because those are the responses they're going to select, the ones that get more reinforcement. There's also ways to fade in the very beginning across the topography, or fading parts of it. So this is another one people get stuck on because they get used to prompting and then taking away the prompt to fade it. And for many of these students, you cannot fade immediately. So you're going to wind up doing very gradual fades, okay? Where you might prompt, if it's a sign or a full physical prompt, and then on the next trial, an almost full physical let go at the very end. And those are the things that lead to success, because otherwise they never get to experience any responses that are contacting reinforcement because it's too hard for them. So that means we have to alter what we do to make sure the responses are easy enough, and the more independent, the better. If we don't have completely independent, at least we were able to fade. So those are students that you're attending carefully in the beginning to the amount of trials you're able to fade your prompts, because now you can see some progress even though you still haven't gotten independent responses. And then in general, for most of the skills, not just for these, you're going to wind up using your faded prompts. I'm going to attempt to play this video. It was giving me trouble earlier. If not, I have my file ready to play it from. Nope, it's not going to work. I know it. So I'm going to do this. Escape from this quickly. And I want to show you a very, very early man sequence. What you're going to notice here, okay, and this is an important point. I absolutely love this video for this reason. What you're going to see here is a teacher with a student, and she's teaching him several mans. Pop-Tart, Bounce, and Tickle were his three targets. Pop-Tart was just tapping the table. Bounce was patting his laps, although sometimes he patted elsewhere. That was a little bit of a complexity that then, we were able to shape into different. If it was Pop-Tart, he had to pat on a surface. If it was Bounce, it had to be on his lap, because if not, what if he was elsewhere and He like if he was on a ball and patted on the ball, how do you know if he wants a Pop-Tart or a bounce? So we had to distinguish it somehow, but we didn't worry about that early on. We made it so that it was easy to see if it was a table, if it was a Pop-Tart or the bounce. And one of the ways the teacher did that is she always presented it for free to offer it, and then she knew that's where the motivation was, and she could run the trial and know she was getting the response for that. But the one thing I want you to focus on the most is where I'm going to eventually stop the video after, where you're going to see that she's prompting bounce, which was just moving his hand like this. As she's prompting him, this is an important point, she prompts and she stops. She takes her hands away. He then is going to be coming to the back, and it's in this motion, and basically he's trying to find her hands because he just adores her and wants her to come hug. So this occurred as an accidental, unintended movement that most people will say, I'm not going to reinforce that. That wasn't his intention. It doesn't matter what the intention is. Don't forget, we're not reinforcing the student and their intent. We're reinforcing behavior. And if the behavior occurs, we reinforce it because it'll be more likely to occur in the future. So sometimes that's how we wind up being able to get our initial responses, because it's an accidental occurrence. It doesn't matter. Reinforce it anyway. So you're going to see that happen, and of course she reinforces.
Nisha, there's a Pop-Tart. Pop-Tart. Oh boy, here we go. Tickle, 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 tickle. Some tickles. Tickles. Here we go.
And what you notice also is the variation in how she delivers things.
Bounce. Here we go.
She's not always tickling in the same way. She's not always bouncing in the same way. And every time she's also saying it. Do you notice that?
Oh, we're swinging. Yeah. Swinging. Whoa, here we go. Side to side, we're swinging. 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 There we go. There we go. Come here. Oh, there you go. Do you want to bounce? Bounce, we can bounce.
Notice how easy access. She's not requiring any effort from him. This is how you would want to start.
Feet up, here we go. We're gonna bounce. Bounce, here we go. Bum, 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 bum. Bum, 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 bum. Oh! Should we go up? Should we go up high and bounce? We're gonna bounce. Bounce, here we go.
Notice that for all these first trials, she hasn't even attempted a fade yet.
Oh boy. Bounce. 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 Bounce.
Did you see it? So that's the kind of stuff that most of us, I think if we all, this is him just a few weeks later with his mastered man. This was probably about, I'm going to say 7 weeks after that first video. That's his Pop-Tart.
Pop-Tart. Bounce. Come on up.
Gives him some free tickles.
Bounce.
You got Mans for bounce.
Come here.
And again, the variation, the bounce doesn't occur always in the same place, in the same way.
Bounce. 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 Jelly arms. Jelly arms.
So this is tickle. This was his approximation for tickle, which I actually had told him, that's too hard. You're not going to get that. They got it. And now you're going to notice, next one is koosh ball. That's what you call that. And it was just fist now on the table. So all the responses are so easy.
Koosh, that's how you see it.
So I'm going to stop that one. I'm going to come back here. And now I'm going to show you this video that you're going to see is now probably like five or 6 weeks after that first one you saw. Says, how about a hug, and gives him a hug, but doesn't model a response. And there you get a hug. And what's this? Actually the beginning of an instructional session where what she starts with is fun, some manned opportunities, while another student right here is doing independent work that she's monitoring. So trust me, it's not under ideal conditions, but it's certainly worth it, right? I would have never dreamt myself, even though I'm here. You know, I said, this could take a while, you know, establishing these initial responses, but you can't give up. That's why you can't give up. But the reason we don't get there is, I think most of us would admit that we would intend to reinforce some of those initial responses, that we wouldn't have selected those initial topographies that are so easy. But if we don't, now it becomes so hard that the effort kills the motivation. Now you have no value. This is too hard. Forget this. I'll just go back to screaming. That was a lot more effective. So that's why we have to make it easy. We have to start at a place where we're going to be able to have some behavior that they can perform so we can reinforce it. As soon as possible, once the student has established a few mans, there have been exceptional cases where the mans have been harder to teach for us than establishing some tact repertoire, but that's exceptional cases. In almost every case, you want to start teaching tacts as soon as possible once they already have some mans under their belt, okay? And then you want to make sure you have a way to prompt the tacts, because remember, for the mans, we're using physical prompts. And oftentimes, that's how the students who don't have any imitation or echoic behavior have their first echoics and imitation, because because the motivation is involved that something is valuable, they tend to engage in the responses a lot more easily. But once you've established whether it's the first imitation skills that you now have something to prompt your tacts with, or they have echoic behavior so you can do vocal tacts, then you would start your tact program. You just have to make sure you have a sufficient head start on what you're going to prompt with. So you wouldn't want to start a tact program unless you already have at least 8 or 10 of the imitation or echoics, because you have to stay ahead of it or you're going to get stuck and have to stop your tact program if you have nothing to prompt it with, right? So that's the most critical valuable. So notice that the recommendations, for general recommendations for teaching tacts to early learners, look almost identical to the MAND, except here you're not looking at check for motivation before each trial, right? Make sure they want what you have. What you do check for is make sure you have valuable things that you can reinforce them with when they engage in the response. You also make sure you provide sufficient opportunities, sequence them carefully. And here's one I didn't mention for the MAND because it wasn't relevant in the MAND, and actually the only thing I should mention about the MAND is that you don't want to have a verbal SD. So most people do the following. Did you hear that teacher once say, "What do you want?" Nope. Because what should control the MAND? It's motivation. And in an early learner, motivation plus the presence of the item. Even in early toddlers, that's how they ask for things, when they see it and they want it, right? So what happens is most people, they get into this "what do you want" frenzy, and now the child learns that they ask after somebody says "what do you want," and it becomes this verbal SD that the MAND response becomes dependent on. And then you don't get the initiation. Someone else always has to initiate by saying "what do you want." So we kind of consider that a prompt in many cases, and have found that oftentimes it blocks acquisition. There was actually a case study that several of us ran, headed by Lori Chamberlain, one of our consultants, where we took students and we made sure they were equal value and taught some MANs using "what do you want," some without, and all the students acquired it faster without the "what do you want," and later on had more independent initiations than the ones that were taught with "what do you want." So that's something to keep in mind. But in terms of establishing tacts, something that happens is that we can emit a tact response under teacher control by several different things. I say, "What is it?" Student says "bike." "This is called a bike." "Tell me what this is." "Name this." "What do you call this?" There's many ways you can ask the student to tact, right? So that your teacher mans, and that's the verbal SD. But when you're teaching new skills, this is a principle of effective instruction too. I mentioned this for those of you who were in my math session. You want to keep your verbal instruction consistent, because then the relevant information you're teaching is what is emphasized. So for early learners, it's important that we always stick to a consistent verbal SD, whether that be what is it, whichever one we're going to get stuck with, we're going to teach. Be consistent, because now what's relevant is bike. What is it? Bike. When you teach this one, what is it? Car. So now every time you present something, what's going to be relevant, what they hear, is the name of the item you're teaching, and not all these other words that you're using that now they have to attend to and take away from the attention to the most important stimulus, which is this and what you say it's called, okay? So keep that verbal SD consistent in the beginning. Once the student has a decent repertoire of tags, then you can start fading those in with things they know. So you've already taught some tags. Now you have several pictures out on the table, and I have several little items here, and I can say, what is it? And they say Slinky. Yes, and this is a, and now I can start fading those in because you're engaging in tag behavior, and it's easy to teach it without them even noticing it, as opposed to trying to teach them what they had to learn. The verbal SD means I want you to tag this and the new tag all at the same time, which makes it harder, okay? And then you definitely want to make sure that it's the right stimulus that's controlling the response. That's why we have to be careful. For example, whether this is a picture or an actual item, if this is the only car I teach, let me see, let me use something that's going to reflect what I'm trying to say. Okay, this will work. So if I'm not careful, I'm teaching marker. And this is my sample of marker. For those of you who are out at webcast and you can't see well, it's a yellow marker. And I'm teaching marker, and this is the exemplar I teach, and I don't teach other exemplars with different types of markers. So if I'm going to teach markers, this is what my array should look like, because I can't have just this. Why? Because this is what often happens with many of our students. I taught this as marker. Now I pull this out. What is it? And student says marker. It's a yellow bus. What does that mean? It was the wrong stimulus that was controlling the response marker. It was actually the color of it and not the parts and features that make it a marker. And that's why we have to be really careful about how we select the things that we use to teach, okay? That's super relevant, and that's what we mean by the right sources of control. So we'll try this again. Nope, not gonna work, but I'm prepared because I knew this was gonna happen. So here we go. Here's just a video sequence of early tags. This is an example of a student who actually, not even by teacher preference, but because we all have to be respectful sometimes and you don't want to get into clashes about response form, would we have preferred that all his responses were via sign in the moment? Probably. But because that wasn't a possibility, this student actually had a device to mand, but at least was using his signs to tact and was still being able to access the tact repertoire, which is great.
What do you see? Bear. What do you see? It is a bear.
So if you notice, she just very gently put her hand on his hand. She's not pushing them because he tended to move his hands a lot, and she didn't want him engaging in other responses that then could get changed, and now bear becomes this. So instead, she just puts his hand in neutral, make sure they stay there. What do you see? And she prompts very quickly. He has the imitation already, and that's how you would teach bear.
And tell me what this is. It is a bear. You got it, buddy. And what do you see? It's a hat. Nice job.
Notice that very early on, she's using actual objects.
What's this? It's a dog. Good job, buddy. What do you see? It is a hat. Good job, buddy. Touch. What do you see? It's a hat. That's right. And how about this one? It is a shoe. Nice saying shoe. Let's go to the sink.
So one of the things to take note there, and that we would also recommend you do always, even though this student at this point only had a handful of tacks, less than 10 for sure, I can tell you that, that teacher ran tacks all the time because he had a lot more of all the other responses. So if you don't run enough of them, if you wait to get back to those few tasks and you only ran them once within a sequence, it's going to take a really long time. So the more she gets in responding verbally, the easier it will be to respond verbally in the future and to not lose those tasks in addition to it. So next one would be imitation, right? And I spoke a little bit about it already. Again, notice same rule of thumb, right? Enough opportunities to teach, sequence from easy to hard. What's easy for imitation? For imitation, easy is starting with movements that are grounded, that are bilateral, that are proximal, meaning closer to body rather than distal, that are closer to the head rather than caudal, which is closer to the feet. So that are bilateral movements. So doing this is actually easier than doing this. And this is why don't you see babies engage in repetitive kind of movements. So if you know those rules, then you don't make mistakes of introducing an imitation such as do this too early on for a student who still can't even imitate grounded movements, just because when you assess they couldn't do that. So that's the difference it makes when you understand these principles, and now you can sequence your targets from easy to hard. In terms of prompting, it's an imitation, and if they can't do what we do, the only way we can get them to do it is by using some form of physical guidance. There is another way that we sometimes get movements, and it's the context for the action on objects early on. And you'll see how those are the first imitation skills we teach to students who don't have any at all. So if the student already tends to do this, when they see a car, I have a car, student has a car, I say do this, they were going to do it anyway. But now I get them to engage in the response because I'm doing it, and then eventually fade in doing the same thing with something that's not a car because they already have the movement there, okay? That's just something to keep in mind, that you can use context. And once you have enough contextual imitation responses, you can start fading in the out of context, making sure you start with the easiest, and making sure you start now teaching it in discrimination with something else. So if I'm teaching something that's not in context, I have to make sure I teach it against something else, or then they just do the same movement when they see an item that's not in context. So in order to sequence our imitation skills so that we get novel responding sooner than later, we do the following. First, there's always this rule of thumb when we're introducing new skills that you want discrimination. When we say, for me to say, the student knows what a house is, they not only have to respond house to this, but they cannot respond house to this. Because if you have some response, then the SD controls it, and this is what would be called an S delta, anything that doesn't signal availability or reinforcement. When you have students who are calling other things house, then you can't say they know house, because that's not a house. Why are they calling it a house, right? So similarly, if I'm teaching imitation and I'm only teaching one, now I'm not teaching that discrimination. You always teach it against something else. And then, even if it's in context, you want two different movements in context. You want to teach each object. I don't make the mistake of only teaching rolling with the car, because what happens eventually, now it's controlled by the object, not by watching me. So eventually, I want them to tap the car, I want them to slide the car, I want them to turn the car over, I want them to tap the arm with the car, and I do all sorts of different things with the same object. I also engage in the same movement across a variety of objects. So they can tap the car, they can tap the slinky, they can tap the bike, they can tap the house, until they can tap anything. And that's sort of how we program, because what winds up happening is you get quicker to the point where it's like that get it. Okay, now I got it. I can do this movement when you do it, no matter what I have. So we program for it in a way that's going to lend itself to that generalization, where you see that in the beginning it might take you a while before they do novel items with the movement you're teaching, but eventually you introduce a new skill with only 2 exemplars. Now they can do it with anything. And that's what you're shooting for, because eventually you don't have to be teaching each exemplar as a different target. This is just very early on. And then, of course, we have to make sure we have sufficient training. And again, keep your verbal SD consistent in the beginning. You can fade in after, but stick with just one. So you stick with either do this or whichever you want to do, but you don't want to start do this, do what I do, copy me. How about this one? Early on, when they're still trying to grasp the concept of I move the way you move. The simpler we keep it, the better, okay? So I know you're not going to be able to see it, but this is an example of what the skills tracking sheet looks like. It's in the resources in the folder that is put together in the Groupio app for you. And these are the first early imitation skills with objects that we teach. Imitation with objects are easier than imitation without, okay? And they're all in context. So the movement is in gray. So this says push, put in, put on, stack, put together, or snap. And then underneath each are several items. And then the last line on each says any novel item. So what you would do is you would select two movements. When you assess, if the student has this one but doesn't have this and this, these are the first two you select. You fill it in sequence because they're ordered in regards to ease of production. And so you select two movements at once with two objects each. So you would have 4 active targets at once. And you master out each target. Whenever they master a target, you introduce a new one. But you stick with those 2 different movements, and only when they get the movement across any object, how do you know they're there? Well, it happens to be you introduced a brand new object, and without you even teaching it, they were able to do it when you modeled the movement. Now you say, throughout the day, let me throw a bunch of other objects and see if they can do it. You got it? That's when you would enter the date of the any novel item, and now you introduce another movement in its place. If you sequence it that way, and the first 2 pages look exactly the same, you tend to get to that generalization quicker. In addition, right here at this part of the page, tap and slide come in, which are no longer in context. There's nothing about a car that tells you to tap it. There's nothing about a slinky that tells you to tap it or slide it. So now if we bring in the tap and the slide, this is when we first start teaching actual true discrimination out of context, which is the reason why we suggest in general for most students, don't start imitation without object until you have these first 2 pages completed. Because that's when you know you have some discrimination established with imitation, and you know it's easier with objects, so now it'll be easier without, okay? So, in terms of transitioning from objects to no objects, just some considerations that'll help is using the actions with objects to teach the ones without. So if you taught the student to tap this on the table, but they still can't tap on the table with their hand, first do the one with the object, then take away the object and do the other, and they'll be more likely to engage in that same movement again. You can tap an item on the belly because you've taught that with the object. Now you can take it away, tap it without. And that's one way to get the movement, okay? So the action on the object can be used to prompt the action without an object. So, nope, it's not gonna, I don't know why these aren't working. So here, you're going to watch a video of teaching early object imitation. I want you to notice the subtlety that she reinforces in regards to the similarity of his movement to hers. It's going to be a probe, so he's going to get the first one incorrect. So he doesn't get it. That was a probe.
Do this. Do this.
Notice the fade, how she prompts almost entirely,
that's how you
and
do
let's
it.
go almost at the end and then gets all excited and differentially reinforces because he finishes tapping it, right? That's the idea.
Needs work.
And then watch what happens.
That's how you do it. Put in. You're so good at that. You're so good. Here comes some squeezing.
Do you notice how super easy the things she's having him do are?
Some squeezes for that. Some squeezes for that. That's how you do it, buddy.
And now here's the check trial, and observe what he does.
Do this.
And it was a bear lift.
That's how you do
I mean, that was a barely a tap.
That's how you do
And most teachers would say, that was wrong. Why didn't she reinforce the first one? He just touched it. You can engage in any movement while you're touching. Now this is him a few weeks later after having mastered some imitation. And there you have it.
You got it. Way to go.
So,
Sorry.
we'll go back here, and I'm going to show you this little guy now during the following visit, which was about 5 weeks after this.
Good, Desmond. Do this. Yes. Do this. Do this one. Do this. Do this. Good
There is
job,
nothing anymore about that cup that suggests, notice it's not, I put it to my mouth, as most children, because that's what we teach with the cup. We're trying to get to the goal of teaching out of context, but we start in context to make it easy so we can get here easily. And in the beginning, even if it slightly looks like the movement, don't be hung up on, no, but he didn't really tap it. You know what? He picked up that shoe. That's part of the response. Be generous, because otherwise you're not going to find anything to reinforce, and you lose that opportunity to establish that response. This is just an example of the imitation without object. It's in the resource file, but what you'll find when you use it is that it starts with very, very easy movements. So it'll have things like tap table, tap belly, slide, rub belly, tap arm, slide arm, tap hands, slide, rub hands together. These are all movements that are easy to produce. It also includes some very, very easy signs to produce. So things like piano and pig and lion and dog, movements that are easy to produce so that you can morph into your initial imitation skills that are then going to serve as your prompts for your tasks if your students don't have vocal behavior. Even if your students have vocalizations, you don't stop when you get to the sign, because those movements are easier to produce than some other motor movements. So it has a nice pool of ideas for movements that are easy to produce that you can target. And then next skill we'll talk about is listener responding. There's two types of listener responses. One would be following directions, right, to perform actions or do things. And the other would be the listener response in terms of discriminating items. So they're super important to teach. You don't teach them at the expense of mans and tax, because they're nonverbal, and generally listener responses become a lot stronger when we have verbal behavior, because most of what we do is guided by what we say, much like when I called Laura to bring my brown bag, right? So we generally start by teaching at level 1 the following directions, but they're in context, okay? So same ideas in terms of opportunities to respond. We start with in context. We start with actions that with listener responses that include actions they can already produce. So remember, we did that assessment to see what movements they can engage in. Are there any actions with objects in context that they can already produce the movement for and will be easier to teach? So the in context and the existing movements are two things that are going to make acquisition easier in the beginning, okay? In terms of selecting named items, generally we don't start there too soon, and if anything, we usually start with teaching the selection response by itself first. So teaching things like putting an item right in front of them and saying touch, then in front of them at the table, then at the right upper corner, then here, until they can touch it anywhere in the table. We also do that with give, so that now they already know how to select. And get this, eventually, if they know how to select, they know what give means or touch, and you teach them the tact, then now how easy it is, touch car. I could have had a V8. Somebody would have told me this 20 years ago. So fading prompts, all of those are the same as before. So the last point is what I'm trying to say. Oftentimes these students don't have the scan or the select response, so we can teach that in isolation, which is taught a lot more efficiently and a lot easier. And then when we bring it to now selecting items, they already have that response, and we're not trying to teach 3 things at once, okay? So in terms of following the directions, make sure that we're stating them in simple terms. Sometimes we do things like using a promise reinforcer, something they really like, we hold it up. If there's something here, if I'm dangling the carrot in front of them, they're going to be a lot more likely to do it, right? So we start off with things either in context, like if the student, every time there's a chair and they come near it, they sit down, Go ahead and tell them sit down while they're about to hit the chair. It's going to happen anyway. But now you can start establishing your verbal SD, your verbal instruction, as a source of control for that response. And then you can reinforce it, right? And then we also teach it through context control, similar to what you saw with the imitation, okay? We generally use imitation as the prompt. So if I'm going to teach touch head, I would say the verbal SD, touch head, and immediately prompt, right? Touch my own head, then the student does it. And then I would run my transfer, distract, and check. However, for the in context, you don't necessarily have to have the imitation mastered, because the context control, if I'm going to say roll car and they already know how to roll, then I just have to say roll, and it doesn't matter that they can do it, because the context, they're going to go do it anyway. So the context helps us get the response. What we're trying to establish is the instructional control of our verbal SD being what precedes their response, okay? So I already spoke about the discrimination of items in the field. General recommendation is teach the selection response first. So, sorry, doing this the wrong way. So the other piece is that in terms of field size, when you're teaching listener discrimination, once they're ready to start selecting items, you're going to start with a very small field. The items that they discriminated from are very different. So you have an apple with a tree and a zebra. But eventually, you bring in the apple with the strawberry that might have more similar features. But in the beginning, you have to make it easy or it's going to be really hard. You start with small fields, gradually increase the size of the field, increase go from neat to messy arrays, and eventually fields where everything is all mixed up, one on top of the other. I'm not going to go over in detail the match to sample protocol, but because it's so similar to that selecting named items, I put them back to back so you can see it. It's similar to the LR. So initially we usually use objects. The best objects to use in the very beginning are nesting objects like bowls, plates, cups, because then they stack on each other, and those are easier or flat items that easily go one on top of the other. We start generally there. We fade in pictures. When you start with your pictures, you want them clear. You want clear pictures, different from each other, white background. But eventually, we bring in other pictures that are identical, that are messier backgrounds, and then eventually that have similarities with other pictures in the field, right? And we increase the size. You always want to use identical in the beginning, because if they don't have the tags, how do you match a glue stick to a bottle of glue if you don't have the tact for glue? If you can say glue, that's glue, here it is, here it goes. So we only do identical matching. The only way we do non-identical is with things that look almost the same. So it's two bikes, they might not be exactly the same, but all the bikes look pretty similar. Other than that, you would never go to non-identical items until the student had a tact repertoire. You can teach it errorlessly, but then they only know how to match the ones you taught. So this is what the skills tracking sheet looks like. What you see is, this is the example. We tend to teach matching two ways. One, items are in the field, so single item is there. Let me use the bottle since I have two identical ones. Single item is there. I have this one here. I say give. Remember, give is one of the in-context response we teach anyway with the handout. They hand you, they don't have to discriminate from anything. This is the only thing there, but we teach the response. We also teach it where we hand the bottle, match, and they match it. How do we teach it? We start with the item right in front of the student, then to the right, then right upper, then the left, then here, until they can do it with any item in any location at the table, and they get that generalized, and that's how you would want to teach that. So, social skills, this is the biggest thing to know is you get this through conditioning, through making sure when they look at you, you reinforce. When they come to you to ask for something, reinforce. Anytime they're near you, things get better. That's when you start getting social initiations. You don't want to focus on teaching eye contact too early, but when it happens, reinforce it. That's how you teach it early. And it happens then naturally, as opposed to a very artificial, look at me. Who looks at anybody when they say, look at me? That's not when you look at people. You look at people because they're of value to you and you want to interact with them, right? That's why we look at people. The only time in life when look at me is involved is when you're in trouble as a kid and your mother says, Amiris, look at me when I'm talking to you. In which case you just look down and run away. So that's not how we want to teach these things. We want to teach everything under the right sources of control. So you want to teach kids to look, teach them the value of your eyes, and that's how you do it, okay? So in terms of organization for the early learners, here's how it goes. What we do is use two bins of whatever size we need. And one of the bins is an active bin that has all the materials. The other one is a done bin. You pull out an item, you run a trial, you throw it in the done box. When you're done, this one becomes your active, this one becomes your done. And so you can rotate through because the cards aren't going to help you at this point. How do we guide what we say? We use charts on the wall that are organized in alphabetical order so we can find the item easy. I personally recommend, this is at least what I used to do when I used this. I have a label maker, or you could use a piece of masking tape, and you could write the instructions that they know how to do and tape it right onto the objects if you want. But some objects are going to be really small and are not going to lend themselves to that. But those are both two ways you can do that. So this is an example of a wall chart. This I just took from a classroom. It's not one I made. So you notice this one is not in alphabetical order, but I'll tell you, those teachers, they had no problem running it. I could never find the items if they weren't in alphabetical order. So what you see is all the imitation skills are in purple, just like the color code of the cards. All the LRs are in pink, and this student also had some matching, which was in white. Okay, the target, the teacher highlighted. This was just her system. So if she pulled out a ball, she could run any of those trials as easy, as opposed to coming to a card that says tap ball on table and now go scrounge in the bin to find the ball. I don't know if you've ever been there, done that, but it's okay when you only have a few of those and you come to that card and set it aside and just go to the next one. But when all of your trials are like that, now you're going to be doing that every single time and you're going to be stuck. So this is another example. This is more the kind that I like, where it's alphabetized, and then you have both your LR and your imitation for each of the items. So you can easily find it because it's in alphabetical order. When a new one comes in, you plop it in wherever it goes. If you do it electronically, that's awesome. But in other classrooms, they do it in a different way. I'm going to show you. And then if they have generalized responses, so they can do put in with these criteria, if the item is in the student's hand and the teacher's hand is held out, or if the item is in hand and the container is right in front of the student, directly in front of them. If it's in another location, they can't do it yet. But now I know that if I pull any container in any item, I can run any of those. Make sense? And now you can run those with anything. Same for imitation. Once you get to this point, though, you can start getting your cards ready that will say, for example, for imitation, do this, tap any item on the table. And that's how you start developing your card sort initially. Those cards for those general responses that are novel across things are actually all available on the resource file pre-made that you can print them out on cardstock and cut or print them out on index cards. So this is another way some teachers do it. They put each individual object or generalized response on a paper, and then when they master a new one, they bring in a different paper, and then they can move them around. So that is movable. So if whatever you prefer, some teachers use those science fair displays, the cardboard ones that are cheap, and they plot it there and they plop it behind on some table so they can see it. So whatever works for you, the idea is that you have something to easily access. This is just an example of an object sort, what some of the materials might look like. It's generally going to be things that are easy for the student to do, some of them that you've observed the student interacting with without having pre-planned it. Those are the kinds of things you want to make sure you have. Sorry, I didn't mean to do that. I meant to do something else just so I can watch my time because I'm awful. I can talk forever. This is what I want to do. Okay, there we go. So this is just one case of a student that we worked with quite a number of years ago, came in, and his only skill was taking all the cards in the room, running across the room with them, and then shattering them to the wall and screaming. I'm not exaggerating. So this is a student where his initial programming was solely instructional control, with getting any kind of response that he already knew how to do. If he responded, he got the world, and getting him to approach people, getting him to want to be near people. That was the focus for the first few months. So his actual instruction, the second phase, didn't start till later in the year. And yet, even though he came in, he actually did a bonus year of preschool and came in as a 6-year-old to kindergarten. And despite that, you saw his initial VV map. This was his VV map 20 weeks later. And when you have a child who's already had some kind of intervention for 2 years and you have nothing, and now in 20 weeks you get this, I would consider that a score. These are some of his cumulative graphs. So you see that in that 20-week span, this student had actually mastered 20 mans. Then his other programming did not start until March, just for the record. And just from March to May, he had already acquired 10 tacks. And similar with the other skill sets, they all started either February or March. And you see that he has at least 10 or 12 skills mastered in each of the areas. But if we don't have instructional control and we haven't taught them that responding and talking is good, how do you get there? These are actually the graphs of the student that are on the video, that we just saw, and I'm going to kind of point it for you, but this was his initial man graph. Instruction started here, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, and then 1, and then 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, and the first ones took a long time, and then all of a sudden it's like, okay, I got this, and by the end of that school year he had 7, but he had none when he walked in. So take your wins, because for a student that comes in with that repertoire, that's significant progress, right? The imitation is very similar. Your initial 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, you finally get 1, the next day you get another, and then another, and then another, and then you see how it starts flying. These are individual targets that you see up here, but generalized responses, so movement that were generalized, at the end he had a total of 5. But again, this is a student who couldn't imitate anything. So that's good news, right? And this is motor imitation without object, which he had a total by the end of the year of 8. But that program started later. Listener responding. So now we get into the level 2 programs, right? So level 2 programming, we're going to go through some sequences, go through how we teach it correctly, and hopefully this will be of some help for you. So what are the precautions? Just slow down, people. Just slow down. Don't rush. There's an individual who's been gone for years, who I have no respect for. He was a horrible dictator in my country, where my parents are originally from, the Dominican Republic. His name was Trujillo. And there was a saying he would say, dress me slowly because I'm in a rush. And because when you're rushing through things, you try to go fast and then everything goes wrong. And I apply that, even though I can't stand the existence of that man. I still apply that. You can learn even from your worst enemy. I still apply that because that's the way we should go with instruction. Go slow because you're in a rush. Because you need to get there quickly. You need to go slow and you need to plan. So careful, sequence, make sure you're building the atomic repertoire. Same messages, okay? So for manding, what are we looking at? Expanding that man repertoire. But you're not going to go, now let's teach missing items because he has 10 items mastered. No. You wouldn't move there unless they're already learning novel mans for items really quickly, and they have a ton of them. Because if they still need instruction to learn a man that's in front of them, how are you going to move to missing items? So you have to have the component criteria before we move on. So this is where we focus on missing items once they have sufficient repertoire. Spontaneous mans, which we generally don't program for directly, we get that through a lot of opportunities, right? And not using what do you want. 2-component mans, this is the way you want to go instead of I want. So now instead of just tickle neck, tickle belly, tickle head, tickle ear, tickle arm, now they get better reinforced when their motivation is for a tickle in a specific place of their body, and using more words is more valuable, which is how you get that Sarah comment from the beginning. Only because it's more valuable for me when I'm more specific to my listener, I get better things. You keep adding components. When you come to see, I never in my life prompted a phrase for that child. Never. And all of a sudden, she's there saying, Mommy, can I borrow your fine point light teal marker? I'm like, I don't even know what that is, Sarah. So you get the idea, okay? And then also, once they have a good man repertoire, now you can start doing the yes, no. Oftentimes we introduce this too early. Do you want to? And again, that takes away from initiations. And when they don't have a man repertoire, can then impede. They just wait for people to ask them because it's a lot easier. All they have to say is yes or no. Those are also the students that sometimes when we start too early, do you want the water? Water, yes. And then when they ask for things, tickle, yes. Popcorn, yes. And they add a yes to everything. So be careful with going there too soon, okay? For imitation, we're looking now at increasing discrimination. So now they can imitate when we have identical items. So instead, now we're moving to, I have identical items, you have a set, and I have a set. I do something with a specific item or two, and you can select the right items and do the same. So now it involves more complexity, more complex movements, fluency of imitation, meaning that they can do it and do it fast and imitate a ton of movements in sequence. And then multiple step imitation, we don't go beyond 2 in programming. And 2 simple ones. Because doing this is no different than doing this, which we consider a 1-step, but it's really 2-step. You're doing more than one thing. The reason being, when I say to you, I want you to repeat what I'm doing, okay? And there's a big prize for you. The only way you're going to do that is if you can say, touch nose, touch head, stomp feet, wave. So until students can tact and use those same principles of self-rehearsal, that joint control, that's how you teach that. You wouldn't teach it erroneously, or you'd have to teach every 3-step imitation. So once you're there, you're worried about fluency. You're worried, sometimes you get it for free. But if you don't get it for free, then you would teach it through the process of joint control. And then you want them to imitate without you having to say, do this or do what I do. So getting that spontaneous. How do we do that? Generally through fluency. So you start, I want you to do everything I do and do it as fast as you can. Ready? Do this one. Do this. And now you just keep going without saying anything. That's one way that generally you would start that process of them doing things without you saying it. The other piece is if they do happen to imitate something inadvertently because they did, reinforce it. Reinforce the fact that they did it independently. For TACT programs, we're going to go over the different protocols, but basically we go from items to actions to parts, locations, people, to component tags, adjectives, class of items, fluency. So these are kind of our whole array. The fluency piece should come at every level. That applies to everything. Where if I taught tags for items, I want those to be fluent, okay? Listener responding, program considerations, again, larger fields, discrimination, varied verbal SD, find the, touch the, gimme the, where's the, do you see the, and now they can respond to all those different verbal SDs, multiple component listener responses, just meaning now I can say find the little red ball, and there's a big red ball, there's a little blue ball, and they can find indiscrimination with other things following multiple components. Tap the red car fast, and they can do that versus tapping the red car slow, right? Discriminating in the natural environment and parts of things would be kind of the equivalents of your tag program. Match to sample, it's pretty much just extending the difficulty of your array. At this point, the students have tact repertoire, so then you would do non-identical. And the way you would do it is not by doing the prompts erroneously like you teach the initial match, it's by having them tact it and then telling them to match. Because now that's what's going to get them to find the one that's the same. You may have to model the first couple responses, but that's a skill you should get pretty much for free within a couple days. Replicating designs with blocks, replicating sequence patterns, and eventually extending sequence patterns, which again would be joint control processes. Red, green, blue, red, green, blue, red, green, blue comes next, right? Because that's how you extend sequence patterns too. And in terms of social skills and play skills, at this point we have students who already spontaneously approach adults, man to adult. So now we start focusing on conditioning peers, getting peers to be valuable, getting them to man to the peers, getting them to respond to the demand of peers. When the peer asks for something, can they give it? And trying to condition those social activities. So now we can start working on peer interactions as opposed to trying to play that Uno game every Friday. They hate the Uno game, they don't care for the peers, and we're working on the same thing until they're in high school. Teach them the value of peers, and that's how you get there. And for intraverbal programs, You don't want to go to intraverbals without having a strong TAC repertoire, because now you're just teaching rote responses. Teaching, tell me something with wheels, for them to say bike. If they don't know what a bike is and they don't know what wheel is, that's just teaching a parrot trick. A parrot can do that. You don't want to do that. You want to teach them wheel, you want to teach them bike, and then we can worry when they have a lot of tact responses and teach those intraverbals, okay? This is also where you definitely want to look at personal information. That's always relevant, even for safety reasons, but also for social reasons. When somebody meets you, hi, what's your name? That's one of the first things people ask you. Where do you live? Who's your mom? Where do you like to go? What do you like to play? That personal information is often valuable, right? The last two come later on after the students have a strong tact repertoire. So that would be the feature function class, intraverbals, where they would respond, tell me something that blank, and they could respond to that. And then answering questions that are concrete would be your next level, the what's, the who, and the where's, where it's actually some kind of tact that would control the response. And then finally, the classroom routines and group instruction. This is where you want to start fading in students from working individually to starting to work in small groups, even in dyads of 2 students, where you have them respond together using signals. Don't say it until I touch the car. Everybody, what is it? And now when you touch, they respond. How do you do that? Teaching it with things they already know how to respond to, and what you're teaching them is to respond together and on signal. That's how you accomplish that. So I'll go through as many of these as I possibly can in the little time we have left. As far as the protocols, I'm going to make the biggest punchlines and show you the videos. In teaching actions, most common mistakes is starting it too soon when students still are taking a long time to acquire items, which means that it's still difficult, and now we're going to add another aspect. Or when the items, they're making a lot of errors on them, they're not generalized, they're not fluent, okay? So you're looking at acquisition rates, you're also looking at the fact that they already have a good repertoire. So you kind of look at this, you never even start thinking about it until they have at least about 100 tags, okay? There's 2 types of actions, with objects and without. We generally start teaching the ones with objects, aside from the very common ones like clapping or waving and those kinds of things. Why? Because they lend themselves more to then verb-noun combinations that then students can get to those generative responses quicker. Why do we start actions before parts? Because remember that for the student's entire life, when they see a static item, they've been saying the item. So now if I try to teach a part as the next step, there's a little more difficulty than actions because it's the same static item. Now I'm trying to get them to attend to a specific part. Whereas the action, there's a different aspect about the item. It's moving, because an action represents movement. It's not a static item, which is why we don't teach actions with a picture, because this is not waiting and this is not running. Okay? You only know when you see a picture to say waving when you see somebody in this position, because you already have the tact for the ongoing action of waving, and you can only deduct that that's the movement of waiting. It's the same reason we don't do pretend actions. You don't do this is climbing when you don't know what climbing is yet, okay? We teach through errorless processes, and then early on, we make sure that from the get-go, we're teaching the student to discriminate between what is it and what am I doing, so they don't make errors of saying the name of the item when you ask what am I doing, or saying the name of the action when you say what is it. So the teaching trial actually includes what we call a contrast trial, okay? So you model the action, the ongoing movement, you prompt your tact with an echoic prompt, and then somewhere within your teaching trial, you run a contrast trial, a discrimination trial with the item. That could be before the prompt, it could be right after the transfer, it could be before the check. You want to make sure you end on your action so you can reinforce it. I'm going to run it in all 3 just to show you what it looks like. You ready, buddy? What am I doing? Tapping. What am I doing? What is it? Touch your nose. What is this? What am I doing? Tapping. Beautiful. And then Dean gets tons of praise and he's like, whew, I did it. So you notice there that contrast of what am I doing, what is it? Because from the earliest sequence, I'm already taking care of that so the student doesn't have those problems later on, which we see so often. So I'm teaching them to respond to that verbal conditional discrimination of the response varies because this part of the SD varied, right? So that's what your teaching trial will look like. Now, this looks like it's going to work.
Let's watch some examples of errorless sequences being used to teach some taxive actions.
What am I doing? Tapping.
Tapping.
What am I doing?
Tapping.
What is it?
Glue.
What is it?
Bird.
Find shirt and find the other shirt. What am I doing?
Tapping.
Job.
So you get the idea. And then there's always a contrast with the item as well, okay?
For teaching.
Okay, so how we make decisions as far as this program, Cold Pro Mastery, just like our others. But when do I know I'm done with teaching taxive actions? Well, they can acquire taxive actions within 1 or 2 trials. So I know that in the natural environment, if I teach them a new action, they're going to get it by me just saying it a couple times, right? So that's one. And when those actions are easily generalized to novel exemplars, now you know you don't need all that intensive teaching to do it. So that's how you make the decision, not because they have 20 or 30 or 40, okay? What are they doing clapping? We have 5 minutes left. Which means 10, you know, no. I'll let you go in 5. If you want to stay, you can stay, but you'll go in 5 and we'll end it, and the webcast people can go too. So then we go to the multiple component, meaning verb-noun combination. So similar to our imitation, each action with multiple objects, each object with multiple actions. So in terms of how we prompt, this is how it goes. When you say, what am I doing? And somebody says blanking blank, that's the order it goes in. So what we do is we run a trial for the action. They already know that. We run a trial for the item. And now we're going to put it all together. And we're going to use an explicit verbal SD because their whole life when we say, what am I doing? They just say the one thing. So now we have to be explicit so they can learn the discrimination easier to say both things. And we can fade that out later. So this is what it looks like. What am I doing? Rolling. I'm sorry. What am I doing?
Rolling.
What is it?
Car.
Tell me everything about what I'm doing. Rolling car.
Rolling car.
Tell me everything about what I'm doing.
Rolling car.
What is that called?
Car.
What's this part?
Wheel.
And what am I doing?
Rolling car.
And notice how I faded it out at the end. That process of fading out can go. Eventually, you should only have to do, what am I doing?
Rolling car.
Oh, I got it, reinforced. But even if and then in the future, you want to fade out even to tell me everything I'm doing with the code prompt. It's what am I doing? What is it? Now tell me everything about what I'm doing, and you can use some other cues to kind of, okay, buddy, get ready. Remember, say them all together, which is why you see me making those expressions when I'm going to prompt, because then you can fade out your prompt. When you come to see, you start getting those novel combinations. I'm actually going to show you this student, because this was a new target teacher was introducing, and it was the first time she was going to teach it.
Xavier, what is this?
She's going to run the action with the intent of them putting them together. And he says, zippering jacket. So she knows she has it. That happened in about 3 weeks of instruction. Those are programs that should not be open. If they're open for more than a month or 2, there's something wrong. You started too early. Their repertoire is not strong enough, okay? And then here's what your skills tracking sheet looks like. So again, the movements with the object until they can do it with any novel. Then you move to the next movement. That's how that rolls, okay? Next one is our parts, features. So, oops, I'm getting too excited here. So this is about part whole. That when I say what is it versus what part is it, you can name the specific part. We tried teaching initially with objects that have very clear parts. If I'm going to teach hood, I can actually isolate the hood, the door. You know, you get all your paraphernalia that you get from your yard sales. This door, you can see explicitly, you can point to the window versus a picture where my big old finger would cover 3 parts of the item and then they don't know what I'm pointing at. So you use objects initially to teach parts that have very discrete parts. And when we teach it, same idea, contrast trials. So I'm just going to model for you just because we have a little time. What is this?
Light.
What part? Handlebar.
Handlebar.
What part? What's the whole thing called? And what's this part here? What's this part? Handlebar, Dean, you got it. That's one example of what a teaching child would look like. Notice I didn't even bring anything else in. Even though we say mix and vary demands, this is the time in the program where it is best practice to run all those tasks in discrimination, because that's another thing you're trying to teach, okay? You teach, of course, relevant targets. Be careful to not teach things, you know, there's no phones with cords, don't bother unless you've taught so many parts that now you're trying to teach your child antiques. Otherwise, there's no reason. They need to know home button and volume button. That's what they need to know. So be careful. You can teach the LR at the same time, so that when you do, what part? Handlebar. Student says handlebar. What part? Touch the handlebar. Because at this point in the game, they should be at that point that if they hear it and they say it, they should be able, and you just prompted it, you just showed them where it was, so they should be able to do it, right? So this is just one of the students engaging in the response. I'm actually going to show you this one because it includes an errorless and an error correction. So she's going to be teaching cover. She runs parts he knows. And then you're going to see him make an error where he says the name of he says book instead of cover, and now she runs book and cover in contrast. It's going to
Ready?
go fast.
This part is the pages. This is the cover. What is it? This part is this is the,
Now he says book.
this is the cover. What is it? This whole thing is and this part is the cover. Very nice.
That's the reason we suggest using explicit SDs, because one of the reasons he said book is because she said, and what is it? So early on, what part? Notice I always said what part versus what is it? After the repertoire is strong, then we can start asking it, because if I asked you, what is this? You would tend to say seat. But because for the student, that SD is so consistent and strong for saying the name of the item, it'll make it more difficult to make that discrimination. So with that said, anybody who's interested in tackling adjectives and yes, no, and webbing, you can stay with Go Get Your Lunch and come back. Otherwise, webcasters, has been a pleasure. Even this part is tremendous, because just from experience, there are so many people who rush through these programs and definitely don't establish them strong. I mean it seriously. Anybody who wants to stay, I will be happy to continue demonstrating some things for you. But I hope this was helpful to all of you. If you have any questions, my email is at the end of the PowerPoint. Don't hesitate. Enjoy the little bit we have left of this wonderful conference. Thank you.
There's all more parts. Thank you, Amaris. Real quickly, this was session number 74. And please remember, anybody who's seeking the CEUs must sign in and sign out each day. And the code for this session is TEA 124. That is TEA 124.